Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we do ask that courtesy to check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time throughout the proceedings, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our program and welcoming our special guest is Thomas Spohr, who is director of our Center for National Defense. Prior to joining Heritage last year, he served for over 36 years in the U.S. Army, attaining the rank of Lieutenant General. Among his most recent military assignments were Director of the Office of Business Transformation in the Office of the Undersecretary of the Army, Director of Program Analysis and Evaluation at the headquarters of the Department of the Army, as well as Deputy Commanding General Support for U.S. Forces in Iraq. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Tom Spohr. Tom?
Well, thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. America has no greater advocate for our nation's defenses than Congressman Mac Thornberry, a fifth-generation Texan and lifelong resident of the 13th District of Texas, which he represents in the U.S. House of Representatives. We are therefore lucky and honored to have him as our keynote speaker, commemorating the rollout of the Heritage's 2018 Index of U.S. Military Strength. Congressman Thornberry is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, the first Texan of either party to hold that position. In a time of unprecedented security challenges, he has consistently demonstrated a commitment to ensuring that the United States has the military capability and the agility to protect the nation and our interests around the world. By his actions, he has demonstrated that his priority is to support and to provide for the men and women who serve our country. In addition to supporting increased resources for our armed forces, he has simultaneously been a leader in defense reform efforts to ensure tax dollars are used more effectively and efficiently. In his time in Congress, Congressman Thornberry has served as a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Budget Committee, the Resources Committee, and the Select Committee on Homeland Security. In 2011, he chaired the Task Force on Cybersecurity. He previously served as the Deputy Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs under President Ronald Reagan, as a Chief of Staff on Capitol Hill, and practiced law in Amarillo, Texas. His family has been ranching in the 13th District since 1881, a family business in which he remains actively involved. Chairman Thornberry graduated from Texas Tech University and received a law degree from the University of Texas. His wife Sally is also a native Texan. They have 2 children. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chairman Thornberry.
Thank you, General, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you all this morning, and I very much appreciate the 2018 Index of U.S. Military Strength. I had the opportunity to go through it over the weekend, and it is in itself a significant accomplishment, a valuable resource, and it gives us an important lesson in the trends of the world around us and our own military capability. I also think it comes at a very important time because I believe we're in a time of historic transition where the world the United States built and helped govern since the end of World War II is changing. The question is, what is it changing to? And the answer will be controlled by the decisions we make, the choices that we make. If we decide to abdicate our leadership role, then people around the world and Americans here at home will be less safe and less prosperous than they would otherwise. And so I think that kind of broader context that we are in a time of significant transition helps us when we look at this index of strength and what it tells us. As I'm sure you all know, there are important sections on the overall environment and on the threats that we face. I will confess that having to spend a fair amount of my time in classified sessions, if anything, I think the threats are worse than depicted here. We need to understand those things. We can certainly help shape the environment with alliances and so forth. But I want to focus on that third part, because that is U.S. military capability. That's what we have control over, and that's what our choices will determine. Just to be clear, we have the best military in the world. There's no question about that. But I also believe that we have not been resourcing our military commensurate with what we ask our military to do. And maybe more disturbingly, we have not been resourcing our military commensurate with our moral obligation to support the men and women who are risking their lives for us. It is absolutely wrong at every level for the country to ask someone to go perform a mission for which they are not fully trained, fully prepared, and fully supported. And yet, we have not been meeting our obligations to them. So, as you go through and you look at the concerns that are expressed in this volume, I think there's a lot of validity there. As a matter of fact, a fair amount of the evidence that you read in here, if you go to the footnotes, comes from hearings that have been in front of our committee. The index tries to measure capacity, capability, and readiness. As I'm sure everyone knows, there is grave concern about the state of our readiness today. Much of the country was shocked by the two recent accidents in the Pacific where two destroyers, some of our most capable ships, have been involved in collisions, and tragically, so many sailors died. But just this week, we've lost another training airplane. And if you go back and look at the accidents, not all of which have gotten the attention that the Navy accidents or the C-130 crash, where we also lost a number of Marines, not all those accidents have gotten that much attention, but if you add it up, we have lost roughly the same number of people in training accidents this year as got shot in Las Vegas this week. Certainly, we've lost far more people in accidents than we've lost in combat. And unfortunately, that's the trend of the last 3 years. And accidents is just one measure. It's not the only measure, but it is evidence of a readiness problem that will not be solved quickly or easily. Because part of what comes out when you start looking at accidents like the Navy accident is some of those sailors were working 100 hours a week. Those ships were not getting, the sailors on those ships were not getting time to train. They had to train as they operated. Those ships that were involved in those accidents were not certified because they hadn't had the time to go through the certification process because they're deployed all the time. So part of what you see is a military that is too small, a military that is too old, and a military that is being used at a very high operational rate. So how does Congress respond to that? We do more of the same thing that got us into these problems. Because starting Sunday, we're on a new fiscal year, and for the 9th consecutive year, we started with a continuing resolution. Now, what that means is you got to spend exactly the same amount of money on exactly the same things in exactly the same quantities now that you spent all of last year. And it doesn't matter if the world has changed. It doesn't matter if your needs have changed. It doesn't matter if you don't need to spend the money on whatever you spent last year. You still have to spend the money on the same things in the same quantities. Every single day that we operate under a continuing resolution does damage to the men and women of the military by denying them the resources they need to do the job that we ask them to do. Every single day of a CR does damage. And let me encourage you, if you haven't yet, to go on our committee website, I think it may be on the Senate website as well, and look at the letter that Secretary Mattis addressed to Senator McCain and I on September 8th, because he talks about the specific consequences of a CR starting immediately. So, for example, he says that the consequences for training begin immediately within the first 30 days of a CR, and by 90 days, the training that you have lost cannot be made up because other training requirements have come, and so you never have a chance to catch up. They talk about the Air Force not being able to stand up the new training squadrons. The Air Force has a tremendous pilot shortage. They plan new training squadrons to make up that shortage. That doesn't happen under a CR. For maintenance, the impacts are also felt immediately and, quote, grow exponentially over time. The Navy will delay maintenance of 11 ships, which will affect the entire maintenance schedule for the Navy, which will affect the deployment schedule of the Navy. So you see the cumulative effect these things happen. Army will restrict home station training and postpone all non-critical maintenance. The Navy will reduce flying hours and steaming days for units that are not deployed. So again, it goes to less training. The list goes on and on. One of the things our committee is going to do in the coming days, starting today, is to help explain these consequences to my colleagues and to others, because I think we have all gotten so used to 9 years of a CR that we have grown numb to the consequences of what it means to us. One of the things I keep remembering is Secretary Mattis's testimony before both the House and the Senate, when he said, "No enemy in the field has done more harm to the readiness of our military than sequestration." And then I would add sequestration and CRs, and he makes the same addition. We don't really need to be reminded that we expect a lot of our military. We expect them to defend us against missiles from North Korea. We expect them to help defend us and our allies from aggression from Russia, China, Iran, terrorists around the world. And at the same time, if there's a disaster, whether it's Ebola in Africa or whether it's a hurricane somewhere around the United States, who do we call upon? We call upon the United States military. That's who we look to. And it seems to me if we are so dependent upon them, then they should expect some things from us. So that's the reason the two pillars for the House Armed Services Committee this year are to rebuild and, as General Spohr mentioned, to reform, because it's also part of our responsibility to see that the taxpayers get more value for the money they spend, but to me, even more importantly, that we are agile enough to keep up with changes in technology, the changes in the threat, and so that we can be responsive to defend the country in the way that we should. I was pleased in July the House passed the Defense Authorization Bill by a vote of 344 to 81, which is the largest majority in the last 8 years. And I think that tells you that Republicans and Democrats alike acknowledge that we have cut the military too much. Then, later in July, we passed the appropriation bill at the same level. Today, we're going to vote on a budget which has defense at exactly the same level. So in the House, you will have a budget, an authorization, and appropriation bill passed by the end of the day that doesn't fix all our problems, but is significantly more than the President originally asked for and begins to turn these readiness and other problems around. The Senate last month passed their authorization bill by a vote of 89 to 8 at essentially the same level. The President, week before last, endorsed that level in his speech before the UN. and said in either the second or third paragraph, we're going to spend $700 billion on defense. So I do think you have the House, the Senate, and the President understanding the problem and moving together in a way we have not seen in recent years to solve the problem. But we hadn't got it across the finish line yet. And so we're under a CR until the 8th. I won't go into in detail, but I just want to emphasize, while we're rebuilding, reform is absolutely essential. And you see a number of provisions in this year's House bill, and I'm sure the Senate has them as well, to get more value out of the money that we spend and to shake things up a little bit. For example, we create a Space Corps in order to have a proper emphasis on this domain of warfare, and that's what it is, and you can't stick your head in the sand and deny it. We create a Space Corps under the Department of the Air Force in this year's defense bill to help provide the resources, the focus, and the intellectual firepower to space that we think they need. In our bill, we allow DOD to buy things online through online marketplaces in a similar way that probably every one of us does with Amazon or the other online marketplaces today. Enormous cost savings, enormous efficiency savings, and a variety of changes that those are just two examples of. But I just have to say, I was struck by the Navy's announcement that to operate periscopes on new submarines, they're going to use Xbox 360 controllers, which cost about $30 a piece, rather than the specially designed controllers that cost $38,000 a piece, partly for cost, but mainly because the guys who are coming in to run those periscopes already know how to work those controllers, and they work fine. That's the sort of agility and innovation that I think is required across the board. Let me just finish with a word about North Korea, if I could. When I'm home in Texas, I try to have meetings about tax reform and the upcoming farm bill and immigration and all sorts of issues that are out there, and there are people interested in those things. But by far, the most frequent question I get is about North Korea. And frankly, all my tax reform, immigration, and healthcare meetings turn into a meeting about North Korea. That is what's on people's minds. I believe we've got to put more planes, more ships, more ISR, more missile defense, more munitions in place in Korea because we don't know where this is going to go. But what we do need to do is send a clear message, not only to North Korea, but to others in the region, such as China, that we are deadly serious about defending ourselves and our allies. And we are going to put the military capability there that is necessary to do that. Peace comes through strength, but victory in war, and the hope is to avoid conflict. But if it comes to conflict, victory in conflict also comes through strength. And that's why I think the title of this is so appropriate. It's an index of strength. That's what keeps the peace, and that's also what means you prevail in war. On September 11th, 2001, I was at a breakfast in the Pentagon with Secretary Rumsfeld, and several of us were there. We ended up leaving about 20 minutes before the plane hit. And went through what most people went through with the chaos of that day. But since then, some briefing memos that were given to Secretary Rumsfeld have been made public. And it turns out his staff told him one of the purposes of that breakfast was to encourage members of Congress to support the Bush administration's first defense request for missile defense. So it's interesting to go back and look. This would be, of course, for fiscal year 2002. Do you know that the Bush request for missile defense for fiscal year 2002 was $8.3 billion? Guess how much we're spending for the Missile Defense Agency today? $8.2 billion. However many, 16 years later, we are spending the same on missile defense, and look at what's happened in the world over the last 16 years when it comes to missiles, and the threat that the American people are under because we have squandered the time and because we have not stepped up to provide the strength in defending our country against missiles that we should. I keep being reminded of the well-known quote from MacArthur that the history of failure in warfare can be summed up in 2 words: too late. It's not too late for missile defense or for the United States, but time is slipping by, and we better understand the trends that are explained in exquisite detail in this volume that Heritage has put together, because the future of our country depends on it. Thank you. I think there's a chance for questions if we have.
Yes, sir.
A few?
So if you don't mind, I think there's some microphones. Am I correct in that? Yes. So wait for a microphone, please, and then announce your name and your organization, please. And we'll start with you, sir, right over there.
Good morning, Speaker, or Chairman. I'm sorry, Auto Chrysler Sea Power Magazine. You've talked about what bills, what appropriations authorization you and the Senate are passing. You're still up against the BCA caps. There hasn't been any move in either house to change the caps, and without them, anything that you guys do will be, stopped by BCA sequestration. Is there any chance you can get the caps removed or changed in order to get the money that you think you need?
Yes, and I think it will happen. Just to play lawyer with you for just a second and quibble, actually, you don't have to change the caps. You could put a ton of money in OCO in defense, and you could get up to the levels I'm talking about without changing the caps, but nobody thinks that's a good idea. And I'm not advocating it, but just as a technical matter, you can spend through OCO whatever you want to. But I mentioned the margin that our bill passed, the margin in the Senate was overwhelming. And I think there is there will be a few anti-military folks perhaps in both houses, but overwhelming consensus that we have cut too much and that we need to turn it around. I'm hopeful that if it were up to me, I would get rid of all the caps on defense and domestic. Remember, the purpose of the caps was to be such an ugly hammer that there would be entitlement reform. Well, obviously they failed because none of that has happened. Instead, the 15% of the budget that is defense has borne 50% of the cuts. And we cut defense budget between 2010 and 2014 by 22%. And we're still 18% lower in defense spending than we were in 2010. Now, what's happened in the world in those intervening years? Obviously, the world has grown many times more dangerous. So I think everybody understands that. I believe there will be a deal. I can't give you the contours of that agreement, whether just the sequestration part goes away, whether the budget caps are lifted, the budget caps are repealed. All of those are options. I suspect there will be a domestic and a defense component to any final agreement, but I think it will happen, and as far as I'm concerned, the sooner it happens, the better.
Sir, in the front there, please.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Dr. Michael Krause. I head a company called Secure Chain. I'm about to give a talk to my undergraduate school, Norwich University, and to speak to the ROTC cadets, the Marines, Navy, and Air Force cadets. I try to do so every year. Your comments were superb, but what do I tell young lieutenants? I'm taking the Index of U.S. military strength with me. It's also online. What do I tell them for their future in the next 2 or 3 years? What's your recommendation, sir?
What I tell young people is there is no higher calling and no more noble cause to which one can devote one's life than the defense of one's country and fellow citizens. I think young people, especially today, are interested in serving. And there are lots of ways to serve. For those people for whom it is appropriate, there is no higher calling than to serve in the United States military to help defend the country. To serve, then you give your country something, and you should expect some things from your country and your government. And the country has not always performed, has not always met its responsibilities. But partly because of increasing dangers around the world, which makes their service even more important, there is a recognition that we, the country, needs to do better in supporting them. And I believe, you can tell them at least for me, that the country will do better in making sure that they are fully trained, fully supported in every way possible when they are asked to go perform a mission on behalf of our nation.
With the camera. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Phoenix Huang with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. And I have maybe two questions about China, because one Secretary General Dunford this Tuesday, I think it was last week, mentioned that China will be the greatest threat to the U.S. Maybe in the next 50 years or so. And what do you think of that? And the second question would be on Tuesday, also Secretary Mattis and General Dunford mentioned that about the Afghanistan, that China is implementing their One Belt, One Road strategy all the way through the Mideast. So how do you think of the U.S. military will deal with the Chinese forces in the eastern Afghanistan? And they also mentioned that China, the U.S. military will cooperate with Chinese in some ways, specifically in counterterrorism. So could you please elaborate on China?
Yeah, and I think you have, just in your questions, have given a good synopsis of where we are. It is not inevitable that the United States and China are enemies. We are definitely strategic competitors now in many ways, but we also have many common interests. And the real question, not just for the United States, but for the rest of the world, is whether China will step up to meet the obligations inherent upon a great power. And there's no question China is working to expand its influence through military and economic and other means. But the critical test right now is, what does China do with North Korea? And I know China wants to say that, oh, they're not our puppet, that we can't control Kim Jong-un. The fact is, more than 90% of all economic activity from North Korea goes through China. China has more influence than any other country. And so I do think this is a crucial test for China's meeting the obligations of a great power on how they handle the situation with North Korea in the very short term. This is a crisis that could potentially erupt at any time, and so laying back and waiting and just seeing what happens is not a good option. And I hope that China will meet that obligation of great nations, and that we can work together in common interests in the years to come. But this is a crucial test right now.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, a Japan native U.S. citizen. My question is North Korea. Do you think Japan should go nuclear along with South Korea? I mean, that's a big if, a hypothetical question. but I should
No,
like to know.
it's an enormous question. It's a very good one. I'm somewhat reluctant to offer advice to Japan on such a sensitive and important question. I do believe that our alliance with Japan and the relationship that is growing even closer between the United States, Japan, and South Korea is crucial. And we should look for every opportunity to strengthen it further. I also believe the United States will absolutely defend Japan just as we defend Alaska, Guam, California, or any other part of the United States. We will stand by our crucial allies. It is a very difficult question. As you know, part of the one question is, should the United States return tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea? We had them there once. We removed them in the 90s. It is an option that is being discussed. And even, as I mentioned, more sensitive and difficult question is Japan, which is fully able to develop its own nuclear capability in order to protect itself. I certainly would not say, I can't get out of the negatives. I would not say you shouldn't. If I were talking to Prime Minister Abe, I would not make that. At the same time, I could not say at this moment is absolutely necessary. But it is, I completely agree that Japan must look at every option, as must South Korea, to defend itself. And obviously the nuclear option is one. Which is even more reason for China to come in and solve this so that we all don't have to deal with these difficult questions.
Time for one more question right here in the
Thank you. Daniel Ogden, National District Export Council. We've heard press reports that President Trump is going to likely decertify the Iran's compliance with JOPCA. I wonder if you have any comments on that and what you think from the U.S. national security interest is in our interest to do.
I thought the nuclear agreement with Iran was a bad agreement. And we had some votes in the House related to that. Part of the reason I felt it was a bad agreement is that it was one issue, and there are many issues with Iran's behavior that are very problematic. So I don't know what the president will decide, but I do think regardless of that specific decision, U.S. policy has got to take into account the broader range of Iranian malicious activities. And so that may have an economic sanctions component. Again, like with North Korea, you can do some things on sanctions. It's always good to lead with diplomacy, but those things are going to be more effective when they're backed up by military strength. We see Iran developing missile capability in similar ways to the way that North Korea has developed its missile capability. We have seen Iran be much more aggressive in contesting our ships in the Persian Gulf and in a variety of other ways, and only military strength can push back and hopefully deter that trend line. So I don't want to give Iran an excuse to go full out back towards developing nuclear weapons. But at the same time, you can't stick your head in the sand and count on an agreement that has expiration dates and only is one slice of their activities and say, okay, that's going to solve these problems, because that alone will not. And I think the administration is looking at the larger spectrum, and I think that's good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let's give our speaker a round of applause.
Really appreciate everybody being here today. JV, where's he at? I'm going to take his water. As a career F-16 pilot, he lives on jet fuel and air, so I don't think he needs his water. We'll get him a replacement. So my name is Dakota Wood. I was the editor for this thing that we'll be discussing today, and certainly that the chairman had mentioned. I'm going to give a real quick run-through about the index. As a senior research fellow for defense programs here for about 3.5 years, it's been a real joy to help to bring it together and to harness a lot of the expertise on defense and national security and foreign policy affairs here at Heritage. And it's made possible by a lot of support by a lot of folks. And one of those individuals, Ambassador Biddendorf, we dedicated this particular edition to. An individual who's served his country for many, many, many years, several decades, started off in World War II, a naval officer. By the age of 40, had a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It's pretty ambitious, pretty impressive. Was Secretary of the Navy under Presidents Nixon and Ford, and was instrumental in bringing in systems and capabilities that we still use today, some 35 years later, like the Trident missile system for the Ohio-class submarines, Aegis missile defense systems, and even the F-18 fighter. So to be able to recognize somebody like that with a publication like this is really a pleasure as well. And I'd ask you to give a little bit of consideration to the bio sketch we have on the ambassador toward the back of the book. But again, in about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, I'm just going to run through the index itself, and then that will be followed by a fairly, I want to say lengthy, because that sounds like it's going to take all day, but a fairly comprehensive panel on aspects of the threats, how they coincide or challenge U.S. interests, the nature of the world as an operating environment and alliances, and then specific findings that we had in terms of military capabilities. And so I will be happy to answer any questions you have about the project here and the materials that we go through, but to really do a deep dive on something, those questions might be better handled during the panel session. So we'll dive into this then, and I believe I got my little clicker here, right? As a Marine, a retired Marine, sometimes I feel like a caveman in a space shuttle, but hopefully the technology won't be too overwhelming for me. This is the fourth in our series. The first one was published in 2015. They're kind of like car models, right? So the 2018 Ford Focus is going to come out in September, or October, November of 2017. So the numbering for this in terms of years, this is the 2018 index, but we assess the year that's just concluded from the previous year's index. And it's been fairly well received. You can see viewership or readership has been a five-fold increase since the first one. We're just shy of 1 million page views. I think the last figures I saw were somewhere around 970,000 pages, almost 500,000 unique visitors. If you're familiar with unique IP addresses, it's not the same person visiting multiple times. We've certainly seen it referenced by Congress, Congressional Research Service, the GAO, the Defense Department itself, and the President basically built his national security speech back in September, a year ago, in Philadelphia, when he was talking about what he wanted to rebuild the military towards, and used the index as a key reference for that. Almost all the people I talk with in this particular world in terms of thinking about national security, foreign affairs, is largely in agreement that the military we have is too small, it's too old in terms of the systems that it has, most of which were introduced in the 1970s and 80s, and the readiness that we have seen over the several years has been in dramatic decline, given the sorts of things that we want the military to accomplish around the world. So when we think about U.S. national security interests, sometimes they get quite expansive. You can talk about food security and energy security and health security and all sorts of things. And we distilled that down to three primary. And that would be defense of the homeland. You don't want somebody invading your own borders. Being able to resolve a major regional crisis or war on favorable terms. So if we have allies in Europe or in the Middle East or Asia or anywhere else, and somebody's trying to cause a lot of problems, you want to be able to resolve that fight successfully. So that's the second one. The third one then is to be able to push back to prevent the rise of a hegemonic power that is pushing everybody else out of the region they're trying to control. So in terms of free trade relationships, diplomatic relationships, access to markets and resources and all, you have to be engaged in that game. So those three interests we have in many parts of the world, and then we looked at the various challenges that rose that had the ability to affect those interests, and where those two intersect, threats and interests, occur primarily in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. It's not that we're not concerned about Latin America, South America, or Africa, but again, threats challenging our interests don't seem to rise to the same level. So the ability of the military to deal with that kind of world is what we tried to address in this particular document. It's the only independent assessment that I'm aware of, not only in this country but globally, where an organization independent of the Department of Defense or Ministry of Defense or the federal government looks at the totality of all the issues that we try to address. And again, that intersection of interests, challenges to those interests, and our ability to conduct operations. It's very important to understand that this is not a futures document. So we don't say anything about what the military needs to be in 2025, or where missile programs might be going in the 2030 timeframe. It's like getting a report card for your kid in school. How did our military do, or how did the world do as an operating space, or how did our competitors do in the preceding year? And we report on that. And then when you string these reports together over time, you can clearly depict trends and what decisions were made and how did they affect our ability to deal with the world as it is. We also tried to keep it manageable. Right now, it's something like 440 pages, and we just can't get any bigger than that. Everything we say in there that could in any way be construed as a fact or a declarative statement, we footnoted to any open source material that the average reader could access. So I think we're at 1,450 footnotes, and Bill Poole, our senior editor here, has checked every one of those, going to the footnote. Is it saying what we said it says there in the text? So we're very confident in the accuracy and the credibility and the reliability of the scholarship that's gone into this by probably a dozen different authors that have contributed their talents. So it's a report card about the assessed year, and it talks about the hard military power components. We don't know how to measure talent pool or manpower, recruiting kinds of efforts. We don't discuss cyber. How do you put a score against cyber, right? Most of that is classified. We used all open source materials for this sorts of things. Defense industrial complex, operational concepts, the level of talent that might be in your leadership echelon within the military. So there are lots of things that are significant contributors to military power. Medical support, basing infrastructure, all the logistical capabilities that are required. So send a fighter up to prosecute a target someplace in the world, and it needs tanker support, and it needed cargo planes to get all the stuff there. So it just becomes so expansive that it becomes unmanageable. So we made sure that we looked at the hard military components. How many tanks do you have, ships, tactical aircraft, military formations like brigade combat teams in the Army, and then those act as surrogates for the larger joint force that's needed to make that power projection capability even possible. So it's a report card and some surrogate measures for the larger complex. We also, to really highlight this in the front part of the document, in each of these editions we've had anywhere from 4 to 6 or so topical essays. These don't necessarily assess in terms of measuring things, but we think that they're very important, that if somebody can spend enough time to read 8 or 9 pages, they come away better informed about a regional issue, a functional issue within the U.S. military establishment, so that when we try to interpret what's going on in the Defense Department or discussions on Capitol Hill, if you don't understand the context of a particular issue, of what special operations forces do or what's going on with Russian approaches to warfare, their new generation warfare and hybridization of those kinds of things, gray zone, then it's really hard to understand what might be an important data point or what something might need to be funded at what level. So in this particular edition, we've got 6 essays, some very, very talented authors to look at the domains of warfare. Our own Dr. Jim Carafano kind of ties it all together with the leading essay on what it means to conduct joint operations. And then we've got a series of deeply experienced scholars. Dave Johnson, who used to be with CSBA, is now with RAND, talked about the land domain and why it's either easy or difficult to conduct operations on land. I mean, why do tank formations need to be the way they are? Why can't you go 400 miles an hour across a desert, you know? So once you get there, it's a fairly permanent presence, hard to dislodge, but it takes a lot of time to build up combat power and to go off and do sorts of things. And so he provides context and understanding to why we need certain kinds of capabilities and why we should be measured in our expectations of success in a particular type of operation. And then Harry Foster did the same things with the Telemus Group. On the air domain, we have Alice Crowther from the National Defense University talking about cyber. Our own Tom Callender, where are you at, Tom? They did a fantastic essay on the naval or maritime domain, both on the surface and undersea. And then Dean Cheng, who's also here at Heritage, just a terrific essay on space. So it's expensive to get up there. You can't move around a lot because of the cost of energy. You can see a lot of things, but you also have some vulnerability because of that transparency of the environment. So these types of essays, I think they're just very, very important if you want to get beyond bumper sticker slogans and saying, well, that I need more ships than what I currently have. There's a why behind that that drives budget recommendations from the Department of Defense, and it also drives expectations for, again, what could be achieved when we deal with various types of crises around the world. At the very back of the book, you'll find a nice section called our appendix. Every major defense acquisition program in the Department of Defense, we basically score. So we say, what was the old system that the new program is meant to replace? Is it a new ship or an airplane or a tank? Is it replacing it in sufficient numbers? Does it seem to be on track in terms of the acquisition process? Is it being adequately funded? Is it falling behind schedule, or is it dramatically over budget? So if anybody has an interest about what the Army might be doing with their tank, A1 Abrams introduced in the 1980s, and the Chief of Staff of the Army says they will have that for 70 years. They expect that tank to be in inventory until the year 2050. And there's not even a program on the drawing boards, a new design to compete with other tanks that are being introduced by other countries. So those kinds of details we have for each of the services in every major access program. A lot of the graphics, John Fleming on our graphics department is a wizard at conveying a very lengthy text-based explanation, which oftentimes I have my hard time even reading through myself, and then representing that graphically and so that it's impactful and, again, provides better context. And you've probably seen a list like this and many other sources where it talks about NATO members and how much they're contributing based on a percentage of GDP and how much of that is going to equipment. But what we try to do is take it a step further, and we provide a regional context to it. So if you look at that on a map, it's very easy to see that countries that are closest to a chief competitor, like Russia, get a bit more serious about the amount of money that they spend in terms of their national treasury in matters of defense. And again, so when you place this on a global context and you relate defense spending relative to who competitors are at in the world, it causes your thinking to be, I think, better informed, and we can understand why somebody like Estonia or Lithuania or Poland might be a bit more serious about things than perhaps other countries who have dedicated more of their resources to socializing our socialism tracks in their own economies and the compact between governments and peoples. We also looked at some historical context. So at the end of the Cold War, the United States had a very robust presence in Europe. But over time, over that period of time from 1990, 1992 until the present day, a dramatic reduction in the forward present or forward-based forces in regions where you see the rise of a primary competitor. And so in a graphic, something like this, we can show how that situation has changed for the U.S. and how that might impact the thinking of a Russia or a China or a North Korea, where you see U.S. presence in various parts of the world decline. Meanwhile, then, we'll look at these major competitors, and you see what China is doing in the South China Sea, where it's created islands in the middle of these patches of ground and very much matured and stabilized their presence. In this case, we have Russia and how they're revisiting the Arctic North and either revitalizing or warming up old Cold War bases or establishing new ones. And what goes along with that? The ability to apply those Arctic waters. So whereas the United States has two heavy icebreakers, I believe one of them is in the Great Lakes, the other one is out of Alaska area, that heavy icebreaker that we would use in the northern Pacific up into the Arctic waters is decommissioned, I think, in 2 years. Russia has something like 40 of them. So again, there's a seriousness when countries really want to engage their environment and have a relevant capability to deal with protecting their interests. And so we see a decline of U.S. presence in Europe. A lot of our NATO allies haven't been spending very much over the past 20 or 25 years. Meanwhile, a country like Russia is doubling down on its investments and capabilities and where it puts those capabilities to guard its interests. A lot of discussion today about North Korea. We try to map out all the reporting about how missile ranges have increased and what parts of the world can be addressed by those things. Do they plan on launching large missile volleys at every other country that might be in these range rings? Probably not, but it certainly gives them the capability to do so, and it means that other countries like the United States and Japan and South Korea have to take into account their decision to invest in these kinds of capabilities, even though large parts of their population might be starving. Again, to provide how things have changed over time, the Taepodong 2 back in 2014 had about a 10,000 kilometer reach, and you can see that depicted on the map. Just this past year, it was assessed by several agencies in the U.S. intel community that that range has been extended to 13,000 kilometers. So you can see where it covers over all of the United States and down into the Caribbean. So when we talk about ballistic missile defense, and the investment hasn't changed in however many years that the chairman had mentioned, it's a fairly dramatic picture that we should be taking into account of, and we try to explain those kinds of things in some detail here in the index. Another one would be Iran, and we talked about whether we need to withdraw from that agreement that was made a few years ago on that. And you can see how their missile ranges have increased over time as well. And there's been a lot of reporting that we try to track, linking Iranian aspirations, not only for nuclear capabilities, but the missile delivery vehicles to be able to use them, or at least to use them as a major deterrent or a threatening kind of thing, and bold on their actions, their interests, and what we see in North Korea. And it appears that there is an exchange either of money or information, and you could view North Korea as basically an R&D establishment or a test bed to really mature these capabilities, and then that information and knowledge feeds back into Iran. So you don't have to be in technical violation by doing your own development programs and missiles, but you're learning what you need to know from somebody's program that you're helping to fund. So it's those kinds of insights that our scholars really attempt to draw out. On the index itself and the thresholds, if you're going to score something, score it against what? I mean, what's the basis for determining whether you have too many tanks or too few tanks? And so there are a lot of studies have occurred over time. We also like to take into account historical trends. So if you go to every major war the United States has been involved in since World War II, so Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and you also then look at all of the major studies since the early 90s. So Les Aspin's bottom-up review, all the QDR reports, the National Defense Panel reports, they all come down to almost eerily the same size force, which is kind of, I think, a very interesting point. What that does is it takes the edge off of these discussions about technology. Well, if modern technology today makes my fighter or my destroyer that much more effective, can't I do more things or at least the same with a smaller force? Well, perhaps, but it would only be if your competitors weren't also leveraging modern technologies. So there's something about conducting military operations in a region or a particular country or across a swath of ocean that just requires a certain number of brigades or brigade equivalents, aircraft, cargo planes, destroyers and submarines. And those numbers seem to be very consistent across decades from the 1950s on, and irrespective of the technologies that might be used. So we'll field a new airplane. The Russians will field an S-400 surface-to-air missile system. We've got to field a better airplane. So you have this action, reaction, counter-reaction that occurs over time. So in looking at the regularity with which the United States finds itself involved in a war about every 15 or 20 years, irrespective of administration, political party, economic status, what might be going on in the world, things happen, and they seem to happen with about a 15 or 20-year periodicity. So regularity of being involved in the world, consistency in the size of the force led us to a recommendation that the Army needs to be about 50 brigade combat teams. The Air Force needs about 1,200 tactical fighters, in addition to the tankers and the long-range bombers, et cetera. A Navy of roughly 345, 350 ships, and then a Marine Corps of about 36 battalions. What that does is gives you the ability to actually handle a major contingency and still have enough military left over to guard against opportunism by another competitor in a different part of the world. Because if it takes everything you have to go fight one war, you either self-deter from using your military to do that, or you get so tied up that one of your competitors can make moves in other parts of the world. So that's what led us to the numbers we have, and against which we gauge or we score the current military structure. So if we say that you need 1,200 fighters, and the Air Force only has, 915 or something like that, then they're at a deficit, and we would score that accordingly. Again, back to the graphics thing, to try to amplify what we have in the text. It's just, again, I wanted to provide some examples of the kinds of information we have in the index. Here's a graphic that talks about not only the capacity, but the readiness of the U.S. Army. So just back in, 2012, the Army had 45 brigade combat teams and was trying to build to 48 because of the rotational burden that was encountered conducting operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. With the effects of the Budget Control Act, sequestration, cutting off any additional fundings, they've shrunk from 45 to 31. So that top block is the 31 brigade combat teams the Army has. The Chief of Staff of the Army has said that of those 31, 10 are considered ready across a range of skills, but only 3 are ready enough and postured appropriately to be able to be deployed on short notice in a kind of a fight tonight situation. So that's 31, 3 out of 31, and we're saying that based on history, they need an additional 19. So in a snapshot, you kind of get all that information, and we think it's just pretty neat, and a lot of talent from our graphics guys and working with the scholars to depict information. This is another one we put up there, talks about modernization and the ability of U.S. military forces to engage effectively with competitors. As I mentioned before, the Abrams main battle tank, introduced in the 1980s, has had some significant upgrades in powertrain and thermal sights. A new gun was put on it, but it's still inherently the same tank in terms of the technology that drove it. Meanwhile, you see a range of other countries over the past 25, 30 years that have improved their capabilities, with the Russians out there with the T-14 Armada. No crew in the turret. It's a completely automated turret, automated auto-loading system, so it enhances the survivability, the quick reaction time of that tank system, and a lot of folks in this particular industry are talking about it, quite concerned about it, and is this the new, standard setter that everybody else needs to align with? So again, it's a nice representation of how the U.S. is losing the march. I believe the Army has said in 10 areas of competition, we aren't doing so well across several of them. And General Spohr will get into the details on that during the panel discussion. This is some work that J.V. Venable, our resident pilot, he does not wear an ascot normally during the day. You guys are a hard crowd. Talking about just aircraft acquisition. And we try to make the point here that the modernity, the new technology involved, how those programs come onto line, and the number of those things that you buy ultimately affect readiness of the force, the ability of the force to actually go out and win a war decisively without exhausting the entire force, a Pyrrhic victory, if you will. So way back when, in the 1980s and 90s, prior to 92, the Air Force was buying on average over 500 airplanes across the board, refuelers, tankers, cargo planes, bombers, fighters, et cetera, over 500 a year. Since 92, we have averaged less than 100. I think the number is 96 airplanes. So whereas you have a lot of flying going on, An airplane is built to fly a certain number of hours because of stress on the airframe and chafing of the wiring harnesses, et cetera. They eventually wear out. You just age out the airplane. You need a new airplane coming along to replace that. But if you aren't bringing on new airplanes in sufficient numbers, the number of airplanes you have, your fleet, can only shrink. And so the fewer planes I have, if I want to keep a certain number of pilots trained, there are fewer platforms on which they can train, only a certain number of hours in the day or night that you have flyable weather and the types of conditions I need to train on my skill sets. And then when I actually deploy them to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they're up every day flying those things, I'm wearing out the force. And yet our acquisition programs aren't being kept pace with funding and with the technological advancement that maintains some kind of credibility in our force over time. Again, when we translate that then, as I just mentioned in terms of readiness, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and some of his senior officials in testifying before Congress has given us a number of data points that we can piece together the general readiness of the force as it is. So out of 32 combat coded, which means those tactical fighter squadrons that you would actually deploy out to fight a battle someplace, out of 32, only 4 are assessed as fully ready across the broad range of skill sets that a pilot would need to be able to fly. And JV can talk about that more on the panel here very shortly. As we get into the actual assessments, this is a wrap-up set of graphics, and you would see that in the books before you. We looked at, again, the world. If you had to go out into the world and defend an interest against a competitor, is it easier or harder to do that in the past year? So if I'm going to go to Europe, mature infrastructure, lots of big roads, ports, airfields, a lot of allies that are there. I've got pre-positioned gear. It's pretty easy. And if my alliance structures are strong, it just makes that much more amenable to deploying and conducting operations. If I have to go someplace like Afghanistan and invent everything, build roads, build airfields, it's just difficult. I don't have a lot of friends in the region. That's that much harder. So we looked at the world as an operating environment in general, pretty favorable place. We look at the threats to our interests. We picked Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, and then the destabilizing phenomenon of terrorism in the Afghanistan-Pak region and against the Middle East in a larger setting, very worrisome. So we looked at behavior and capability. My behavior can be really bad. I might not have specific capabilities to present a threat, or it could be the reverse. If you're in China, profoundly capable forces like Russia is also fielding, the rhetoric scaled back a bit. Maybe I haven't been as provocative. So it's the mixture of those two that lead us to the overarching score that you see for each one of those. And then the military power, and I've got a couple slides here at the end. So in the operating environment in particular, as you see, and expressed at length in that particular assessment chapter, we talked about how the world looks and key allies, and whether it's easy or difficult, and a couple of areas, especially in Asia, with our alliances and political stability, we've seen a decline in those. There's been a lot of questioning about the ability for the U.S. to maintain a steadfastness, to be there for allies like Japan and South Korea. People are questioning that. That would say that on our foreign policy side, to be much more aggressive in making these assurances and providing the guarantees that are necessary. And then just some kind of fractiousness in the region itself, right? So some of our allies have had their own problems internal to their own countries, Thailand being one. And so you look at that, what are the implications for that region? And again, does it make it more difficult for us to do things? So it's spelled out in a bit more detail. On the threat side, it's been interesting that, again, as some countries have gotten more capable in their military forces, that their rhetoric and their aggressive, provocative actions from the preceding year have been kind of toned down a little bit. So you don't ignore them. It just seems that maybe they're getting comfortable where they're at. So if you see an actor like Russia, long-range missile shots into Syria out of the Caspian, much more aggressive than any time since the end of the Cold War in the Baltic area, certainly bullying and threatening our Baltic allies, and then into countries like Poland and what they've been doing and attacking and occupying portions of Ukraine, either directly or through surrogates. It's a very worrisome picture. We also then tried to depict it in different ways. This is a capture of how conditions have changed over the course of these four indexes. Just about everybody has grown in capability. So the maturing of use of unmanned systems, more capable missile systems. China is now deployed an operationally useful aircraft carrier. If you think about Russia in 2008 when it invaded Georgia, a string of broken down vehicles for miles. They figured this is not good. They recock, very effective in taking Crimea and pushing into Ukraine. Multiple launch rocket systems, thermobaric warheads on the end of some of these systems. Very good coordination in terms of combined arms maneuver, the employment of air, and then they go into Syria, save Bashar al-Assad from being overthrown. And now they've been able to do long-range missile shots that I talked about, very careful coordination of air assets, so it's movement on the ground. So you see this maturation of capabilities, even as behavior has stayed fairly worrisome as well. Two slides here then on the military. The overarching, we believe that the U.S. military is in a marginal status and it's trending toward weak. It's just the totality of all the things that Chairman Thornberry had mentioned. Reduced funding, not just since BCA, but if you look at the decline in funding since the end of the Cold War. So this has really been a problem 25 years in the making, only worsened by the Budget Control Act. So if I don't have enough money to keep a sufficiently sized force and keep that force well trained and have that force use modern equipment, you start having this spiral of problems. So we've seen that in the size of the Army and in its readiness of many of its units, again, only 3, and a ready-to-fight status. At the end of the Cold War, it was 780,000 active duty soldiers. Now they're below, I believe, 480,000. So you just have fewer people trying to shoulder a massive load with obsolescing equipment and not enough money to actually get out there and shoot your tables if you're an artillery unit or drive miles with your tanks, do those sorts of things. And the same thing happens again with the Navy. We've seen this spate of accidents. Is it lack of money to maintain ship readiness, or is it lack of money to maintain a sufficiently sized force so that my sailors don't have to work 100-hour weeks and you're just mentally fatigued? You know, that these ship collisions could have been prevented with a very attentive watchstander on a bridge wing. So why did they happen? And the investigations that are going into that are trying to pull that out. The Air Force, in terms of capacity, dropped from strong into marginal. Again, it's a reduction and actually a more accurate counting of assets. We kind of fumbled around with it when it was just me and some others, and then JV showed up and provided some expertise, and we were able to better understand Air Force readiness and capacity numbers. So we've seen a decline there. Unfortunately, my own service as a retired Marine has also declined and has now dropped into the weak category. And it has to do with readiness. You just don't have enough units to handle the constant workload and still get out into the field and have your force be very effective. The totality of marine aviation, both on the fixed wing and rotor wing side, I think it was this past January, the Marine Corps itself said only about 40% of those were even flyable. So 4 or 5 out of 10 airplanes, either helicopters or fixed wing, were even usable to get up and then to do the types of training and operational missions that would be assigned to it. On the nuclear side, Michaela Dodge tracks this for us, and probably not many people as good. I don't know that anybody's better than Michaela in terms of understanding the infrastructure, the talent pool, and modernization efforts that are needed for our nuclear infrastructure, which inherently is the strategic deterrent factor we have with all the other actors in the world. We gave it an up score on delivery systems, and that we wanted to recognize the efforts of the administration to really start paying attention to the delivery vehicles. You know, are the missiles and their components, are we thinking about it, and are we moving in the right direction to make sure that they can actually do what they're supposed to do when they're called upon? But in all the other areas, in terms of laboratory facilities, some of which date back to the 1940s, I believe, the Manhattan Project, are still in pace. Most of the scientists that have been involved are very advanced in their years. When you're not designing new things, it's hard to attract new talent in, because where's the excitement of trying and really pushing the boundaries of those capabilities. So it's a very worrisome stage, marginal. The Trump administration, as well as Congress, has said that they're very serious about improving this status, especially seeing what's going on in nuclear developments in Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And if we're not going to be in this game, then we're going to lose that game. So to wrap up, a very quick overview of this book, in practical terms, we think where we're at in terms of capacity and readiness, that the U.S. military is essentially a one-war force. We've talked with the most senior officers in the military services and on the joint staff, and they're absolutely convinced, and we absolutely believe them, that if our military was called in to fight a major war, we would win that. But in order to be able to do that, we would have to globally source. So if you think all the way back to the Korean War, you had Task Force Smith that was thrown into the breach there as the North Koreans came south. And because we had so demobilized in the few years after World War II, we were pulling units and personnel from across the United States and Europe and rushing everything we could to the Korean Peninsula. And essentially, it's that kind of situation in some ways. Much better readiness with the average sailor, soldier, airman, and Marine. And the only reason we're able to do what we're able to do now is because these young men and women in uniform are shouldering that load. And so it's not the individual that's not ready. We're talking about the macro services and our defense portfolio that we're very concerned about. So able to go off and fight one war, but it would take everything we have to be able to do that. And when you're short in capacity, when you start taking combat losses, how long can you sustain operations? So it's not the first 100 hours of a war, is what does the first 2 or 3 months or the first year of a major war look like? And I think that's where we have great concerns. So the readiness to maintain the current stuff has really come at the cost of deferred maintenance, which you're seeing quite a bit in the aviation and the Navy ship communities, and deferred modernization. So putting off buying the new thing because I just can't afford it right now. And the longer you put off the new thing, the longer I have to use the old thing. Maintenance costs go up. Its relevance on the battlefield in a modern setting also becomes problematic. Deterrent value, there is some comment about why are we saying these things in a very public domain. One, it's all publicly available information. What we're doing is bringing together in a single package to inform Congress and inform the American public. But we would fully expect that the intelligence services and the military analysts in the capitals of Beijing and Moscow are already looking at this kind of stuff, especially given access that they have in the classified world. So we're not saying anything we don't believe our competitors don't already know. Our concern is the American public needs to bring pressure on Congress so that funding is freed up, so that we can regrow the military and modernize it, as the President has pledged to be able to do. So this deterrent value, if our competitors don't believe that we have the military power to back up all the diplomacy, economic incentives, the efforts to bring more people onto our team as opposed to our competitors, if they don't believe we have the wherewithal to do that, that it emboldens them. We see more opportunism, and we start to see the fraying of stability that many parts of the world have enjoyed since the end of World War II. So again, I talked about the ability to sustain operations in a high-end fight, very questionable at present. And again, this death spiral, I know it's kind of an alarmist, sensationalized term, but it goes back to this idea of if I don't have very many things, whether it's the people involved or the platforms, then unless I drop my operational load, those fewer things are used at an increased frequency, more than what was planned. They wear out sooner. More of them break, fewer of them are available, so now I have even fewer in which to train operators or to go out and conduct operations. So it gets into the spiral that's very expensive to get out of, and it takes a great many years. Many assessments out of the Congressional Research Service and GAO say that the Navy's plan to grow their Navy to 350 some odd ships is going to be 2030s at best. Navy shipyard infrastructure is a great report out from GAO on that, assess that even with increased funding at dramatic levels, won't be able to fix the problems in our 4 remaining shipyards, government shipyards, until about 2035. You can't invent a 15-year experienced special operations soldier in 2 years. It takes 15 years to grow those guys, right? So time is not on our side, and we're certainly aware of the monetary and budgetary impacts with continuing resolutions, increasing debt load, overarching, and then the annual budget deficits. So it's not a pretty picture, but we're trying to do what we can do to inform the public on that. So I'm right at time. Unless somebody has a really pressing question, I'd like to really shift to our panel discussion and turn it over to JV, who will lead that. So any questions real quick? Okay, yes, sir. We'll take the one and then move on.
Just real quick, two quick questions. Why is not Middle East terrorism in North Korea under hostile rather than in terms of the threat? And also, and I don't know, maybe that's a question better for the panel, but also just curious as to what cyber, how that factors into the overall threat
Right.
assessment.
So I'll take cyber first. I don't know how to measure cyber. So it's one of these things where if I could excise words or phrases from the lexicon or the pool of words and phrases used by defense folks, we would get rid of leap ahead, transformational, revolutionary, game-changing. They apply these bumper stickers to any program that you want to pursue, but you can't know the value or the effectiveness of a new thing until you actually use it in a combat environment, right? So I invent a death ray. Well, it turns out that maybe the death ray doesn't go through foliage or whatever. You know, I don't know. So in the world of cyber, the real world capabilities, both in our community and in the communities of both allies and competitors, are very heavily classified. So I may find a zero-day exploit, okay? I hold that because I want to use it at the moment. How do I know that my competitor doesn't know that that same vulnerability exists, and they're just keeping it open as a honeypot in a sense, or something that would attract me in? Or how do I know my exploit of that has any kind of sustaining value? You know, will it really bring down the power grid or the integrated air defense system, frustrate their logistical capabilities? So until they're actually used, we really don't know. On a daily, you've seen reports, you know, millions and millions of attacks, just, you know, simple hacking, could be cyber espionage, it could be trying to gain intel, could be trying to put something into a system that you want to remain hidden for a long time. You know, those go on all the time, but I don't know what my competitor knows and what he might be doing to me. I mean, if it's a successful attack, how would I know, right? So the inability then to really understand in granularity the actual condition in the cyber domain led us to keep that out of the index, because it would be a falsehood to us to say we knew how to measure it. Back on the bad guys, how in the world can North Korea not be assessed as being at the top right corner? And what we do is not rely on our own understanding, but we go out to a larger community of contributors and reviewers. So Bruce Klinger, who's a career retired CIA analyst who specialized in North Korea, is on staff here, has access to a great web of colleagues. We try to be very careful that we don't poison this work with direct access to classified information, because we wouldn't want to inadvertently reveal something. That's why everything is so heavily footnoted. But we do send out our reports to a community that will review them and say, are we on track or off base? And so it's a collective assessment. I'll use North Korea as an example, that yes, they're very provocative. They've certainly added a hydrogen bomb capability most people have agreed with to their portfolio. But have they been so aggressive? They haven't invaded Crimea. They haven't been threatening the Baltic states like Russia has, as an example. They're just mean. I mean, they're problematic in their region. And so if we peg them out at the highest categories now, how would we assess them next year if things really do get bad? Give them an 11 on the scale of 10. So a lot of these, we have these debates inside on where to peg it, and it results in the scores that you see. That's it. All right, I'll turn it over to our panelists and be on with that.
Correct. We'll invite our panelists up. And as we bring up the lights, they're coming to shed a little more light on the discussion. I thought Jim would appreciate that especially.
That's my water.
Leading our panel discussion is J.V. Venable. He is our Senior Research Fellow for Defense in the Center for National Defense. J.V. is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He served in 3 combat operations and served at 16 locations around the world as a forward air controller, fighter pilot, and staff officer. And usually the most impressive statistic about J.V. is he is also a former commander of the U.S. Air Force's aerial demonstration squadron, the Thunderbirds. Please join me in welcoming J.V. Venable. J.V.
Thank you, John. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us. This is a really special day, and it's an incredible audience. One of the more handsome groups of people I've seen in quite some time, so thanks for joining us.
You only said that after we walked up here.
That's exactly right. Well, I haven't begun to brag about the dapper individuals to the left, but I'm going to take a minute to do that. Before I do, I want to just take a minute to recognize the man who just left the stage. He gave you a one-to-the-world view of what's actually happening now, and he didn't read one note in the process. The guy who's the biggest contributor to this index is Dakota Wood. His name's on the front of it, but he is throughout it, and he has done extraordinary work. I can't think of a better colleague or a more brilliant individual in this field, and I just want to take a minute to recognize him. This is a different index. It's our 4th index, but this year is different in one major sense. We went through a transition from the Obama administration into the Trump administration, and with that came a very unique window of transparency. Where you had military officers at the most senior thresholds basically being very candid while they could be before the next administration came in. And so this index is different in that sense. You've already got a flavor for what that is. I encourage you to dive into the bowels of this document because it is really well done. But today, what we're going to talk about is what that means. In the big picture, what does this new assessment bring about in the global picture? And I'm going to take a minute to introduce the folks to the left of me, and they'll be talking about individual or different areas in that. Starting on the far left, we've got Frederico Bartels. Fred is a policy analyst for defense budgeting in Heritage's Center for National Defense. Before joining Heritage in 2017, Fred worked as a senior policy analyst for Americans for Prosperity, and he served as a policy analyst for Concerned Veterans for America. His work has been featured on The Hill, War on the Rocks, and Real Clear Defense. Fred received a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Relations from the Pontifical, a very prestigious university in Brazil, as well as he's got a master's degree in Arts and International Affairs from George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. To his immediate right is my boss, Tom Spohr. Tom is the director for the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Before joining Heritage in 2016, Tom served America for more than 36 years in the Army, attaining the rank of Lieutenant General. He has commanded at the company, the battalion, and brigade levels, and served as one of the Army's foremost experts in chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear issues as the commandant of Seaburn School at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. His operational experiences are extraordinary. And they include tours in combat with the 82nd Airborne Division and the 1st Armored Division, and Tom participated in Operation Urgent Fury, the 1983 invasion of Grenada. He served as the Deputy Commanding General of U.S. forces in Iraq during Operation New Dawn, overseeing the safe withdrawal of all American forces and equipment from Iraq, perhaps the most complex and logistically intensive operation in the last 25 years of the U.S. military. Tom holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the College of William and Mary, a master's degree in public administration from Webster University in St. Louis, and a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. And to his immediate right is our big boss, Jim Carafano. Jim is the Vice President of Heritage's Foreign and Defense Policy Studies, E.W. Richardson Fellow, and Director of the Catherine and Shelby Collum Davis Institute for International Studies. He directs Heritage's team of foreign and defense policy experts in 3 centers: the Asian Studies Center, the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, and the Center for National Defense. In his Army career, Jim was stationed in Europe, Korea, and the United States, and his assignments included the head speechwriter for the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and he was the executive editor for Joint Forces Quarterly. Jim served as the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation and advisory board for the West Point Center of Oral History, the Hamilton Society, the Spirit of America, and the Operation Renewed Hope Foundation, which serves homeless veterans. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and serves as a visiting professor at the National Defense University, NDU, here in town. He currently sits on the Board of Advisors for Daniel Morgan Academy. Dr. Carafano is a graduate of West Point. He holds master's and doctoral degrees from Georgetown University, as well as a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. Ladies and gentlemen, would you give a warm welcome to our panelists? As we go down the panel, and we'll start from my immediate left to left, I guess is the way that would go, we're going to talk about several different areas. Jim is going to dwell on the state and status of our allies and alliances, as well as the threats that are out there. Tom on the status of the U.S. military, and Fred is going to dwell on budgets, resourcing, and the prospects for an increased budget for our U.S. military. And with that, Jim, if you would be so kind, sir.
Hey, thanks. Always thrilled to be on the far right of the panel. That's pretty cool. Before we start, I do want to say just one thing what Dakota already mentioned is that we dedicated the index this year to Bill Mittendorf, and Bill is an old and dear friend. At 90 plus, he's writing his, I forget what number book, but I mean, he served his country from a young ensign on a ship in World War II, and he never stopped. And he's just a great American. It's just an honor to know him, and such a blessing that we have people like that serving this country. And he's done so much for this nation. And he's just a really unique and special individual. So if you ever get up to Rhode Island, drop over to the house and say hi, because he's just a great guy. So I think the way I want to frame this is, interestingly, not surprising, and a lot of dynamics to explain that. But what I'd like to say is I think what we're seeing emerging in the Trump administration is a view of the world that is very consistent with the index. And I think that's very important. And obviously, if this was just a partisan document, the scores would immediately go up this year because, we have a different president, right? But it's not, and the scores continue to go down, despite the fact that we recognize that this president is committed through a peace through strength agenda. But there's enormous challenges in a political system to actually putting that into place. But how they view the world, I think, is interesting. So in the index, we focus, even though America is a global power with global responsibilities, we focus almost exclusively on Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with the reason being that those are the 3 regions of the world where we have vital interests, which are essentially non-negotiable. And in each of the 3 regions of the world, the primary vital interest is that they don't blow up, that they simply don't melt out. They don't have to be the land of milk and honey, but a large regional conflict in any one of those parts of the world is incredibly damaging for the United States, and it's not rhetoric or hyperbole to suggest that if you did have a large-scale regional conflict in one of those parts of the world, that it wouldn't cascade into a global conflict. So regardless of what you think about whatever, the one thing nobody wants is this thing getting out of control, because we kill way better than we used to. I mean, if there's a World War III, it's billions that are going to die. And it's not going to stop in a New York minute. Arguably, other than a nuclear exchange, there's few things that you want to take off the table more than the notion of a large-scale regional conflict in any one of those 3 parts of the world. That perfectly matches with what we've seen emerge as the Trump foreign policy. This administration has invested enormous efforts right off the bat in all 3 regions, and I'll just walk them through very quickly. Despite all the rhetoric that you hear about, we're going to pull out of NATO and withdraw from Europe. We've seen exactly the opposite. Talk to Europeans all the time. Europeans are completely reassured the United States is not walking away from NATO. We're not turning things over to the Russians. And I can tell because now they've gone back to saying, okay, the Americans are here to stay. We're excited, so we can go back to hating the Americans and doing business with the Russians and not worrying about anything anymore, other than the populace. In the Middle East, you've seen, I think, a dramatic reversal in the way our allies in the Middle East look at the United States, and almost invariably, whether it's if you go across the Gulf Coast Cooperation Council or traditional allies in Israel or Egypt, literally they are restructuring their foreign policy and security policies built on a pillar of continued and robust U.S. engagement in the region. And this administration, actually, if you were going to say rank those things in 1 through 3 on where you have to put all your effort first, this administration would say that they would put the first priority is the Middle East because that's the one where they think is the most at risk and where we've seen the greatest destabilization. And they would say clearly the two problems behind that, the great threats are Iran and the destabilizing threat of transnational Islamist terrorism from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then obviously in Asia, looking at the competition with China and the threats from North Korea. So if there's a difference between how kind of Trump views the world and what's in the index is this administration has put a lot of emphasis on Latin America. It doesn't get a lot of attention, which is pretty remarkable because normally new presidents don't focus on foreign policy; they focus on domestic policy because that's what they get elected for, right? And no president comes in office focusing on Latin America, and this administration has actually been the opposite. And it's not just about build a wall. I mean, those people who follow this closely is the United States has been deeply engaged in the region, really looking at how to bring some degree of stability, particularly in Central America, because they see that as a key component of relieving pressure on the border, and the primary threat to that they really focus on is the transnational criminal networks. But that's not inconsistent with the index because the index focuses on the application of U.S. military power and the challenges in Latin America and dealing with the transnational criminal cartels. Although there's a military component to that in support, it's not primarily a military challenge. So the fact that it's kind of absent in our index but really ranks high with the administration is actually fairly consistent. So traditionally you heard in the Pentagon the kind of 4+1, North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, and transnational terrorism, and this administration is more like the dirty half dozen. So it's the 4+1 plus the transnational criminal network threat in Latin America. The other area which is, I think, consistent with the administration is this notion of peace through strength. This administration does not have a militarized foreign policy. That's hyperbole, and the notion of, well, there are senior military people in the government, therefore everything's seen through military eyes, all that's completely, utterly bogus. The one feature that people like Kelly and HR and Mattis have in common is their leadership and their strategic vision transcends their military careers. It makes them kind of unique among military leaders. And so to point to them and say, okay, we have military people there, therefore you're getting a military view of anything, it simply comes from people who just don't understand those three people. But there is this recognition that one of the foundations of the application of U.S. military power, whether it's diplomatic or economic or anything else, has to be a strong U.S. military, particularly in these three parts of the world where you have to show a strong face to competitors. So we recognize peace through strength, and the administration does too. And the other thing, clearly what we see is we built the index on the foundation of what is the benchmark that you measure against, and we've always measured it against kind of this two major threat or two major conflict benchmark. That is not a force-sizing mechanism. It's a strategic decision, and it's based on the premise that if you're a global power with global responsibilities, you have to be able to do something major and not give an opportunity for some other competitor to do something behind your back. So you simply have to have the capacity to deal with two major activities at the same time as a key component of your conventional deterrence. And from a global practicality perspective, if you add up all the stuff we do day to day around the world and responding to all kinds of things, that adds up to an MRC. So you're literally kind of using an MRC's worth of capability every day anyway. that's the direction this administration has. And as you know, Bridge Colby is writing the, and I'll finish on this comment. Bridge Colby's writing the National Defense Strategy. We fully expect that a benchmark in the National Defense Strategy will be going back to something like a 2 MRC type requirement. So that'll be a benchmark requirement for future military force planning. Bridge works very closely with Nadia Shadlow. Nadia's writing the National Security Strategy. I fully expect that the national security strategy that emerges, later this year is going to be very consistent with the kinds of things, of policies we've seen coming out of the administration in terms of the focuses I talked about. I think it'll link at the hip with what Bridge is doing at DoD. And I think in the index, they'll have a good benchmark to actually see if they're going in the right direction. And the last thing I'll say is the other key component of that is the ballistic missile defense review and the nuclear posture review, both of which are in process. And we could well see a nuclear posture review by the end of the year. I think that'll actually be very consistent with the kinds of things that we talk about in the strategic requirements in our index. I'm expecting a significant shift from the last administration in how we view nuclear and ballistic missile defense forces, which are much more, I think, in line with what we view in the index as this complementary nature of conventional and strategic deterrent overlapping in the 2 MRC model. And with that, I will shut up.
Well, thank you, Jim. General Spohr?
Yeah, thank you, thank you, JV. And so my remarks are going to focus on the status of the U.S. military, and I'm not going to go into much detail because there's so much to talk about. But one overarching thought I have is that many people have trouble keeping two what they think are competing thoughts in their head. And the first is that America has the strongest and most formidable military in the world, and that military is both inadequate and under-resourced for the missions it faces. And a lot of people say one of the two of those must be true and the other false. But the reality is they're both true. We have the strongest military, and it's under-resourced and too small for the missions we ask it to do. And so that is, for whatever reason, and Chairman Thornberry talked about this earlier, we're having a hard time, the military's having a hard time breaking through with this message that the military is in trouble. But they are, in fact, in serious trouble. And all the chiefs talk about what happens if something bad goes down in North Korea and simultaneously there's something that takes place in either Europe and the Middle East. And they have all testified to a person that would be extraordinarily high risk to have to handle both of those situations. Another thing I want to mention is in this book, we rate my former service, still my service, the Army, as weak. And that, frankly, and I actually wrote that section, and that was hard for me because I have a hard time saying that the U.S. Army is weak. But as Dakota Wood would say, it's all about the context. And we rate the U.S. Army as weak compared to the need to address 2 major theaters of war simultaneously or near simultaneously. And by that measure, even the Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Army would agree that they are weak. They are not up to that task, and we believe they need to be up to that situation. JV talked about this, but the Budget Control Act, which was passed in 2011 and really started to bite in 2012, was not the start of the decline of our military. And I don't exactly know when it began. It's hard sometimes when you're so close to something that you can't really see it for what it is. My personal belief is that the decline of the military probably started at least as early as 2004, but it could have started before then. But 2004 was when, at least in the military, and especially in the Army, the pace of these back-to-back deployments really started to take hold in the Army, and it was a one year deployed, 1 year back kind of thing. In some cases, 18 months deployed, 1 year back. And that not just the time, but the resources it took and the distraction it took from actual war-fighting tasks, where we had artillery units unable to fire their primary weapon system, tank units unable to fire their tanks. We have not recovered from that since. Another thing I want to mention, and that is, in the midst of the war, we started having retention problems. And you'll probably remember, although it goes back a few years, that people didn't want to join the military, probably for fairly understandable reasons, but people also started leaving the military. And so Congress probably rightfully increased entitlements and military pay and housing costs, and that was probably the right thing to do. But they didn't provide us additional monies for that. So that increasing of the entitlements within the military, and I like to call it pressurized kind of the container in which we tried to do budgeting, and removed money that could have been used for other things, for increased personnel costs. And then the operational tempo, which although people think we are out of Iraq, we're out of Afghanistan, we are not really, and we have actually added additional requirements for our forces everywhere. So we are now rotating a brigade, an Army brigade to and from Europe. We're rotating to and from a brigade to and from Korea. And when you rotate versus forward stationing, that picks up the operational tempo even more than just having a forward station there. So I want to hit a few areas, and when we talk about the index, excuse me, we rate it in terms of capacity, and that is size, capability, and that is really the sufficiency of your weapon systems, and then readiness. And there are, if you want to come across as a professional in this particular world, you'll think about it in those kinds of terms, because when you just say readiness, that just talks about how ready are the forces you have. But you may not have enough, and the systems they may not have are not adequate in order to keep up with the task. And so today, in the area of capacity or size, the Navy has 279 ships, and their own requirement is for 355 ships. And they're not even on a trajectory to get to that number anytime soon. And it's just not a number. As people like to say, quantities have a quality all their same. And so even though the ranges of their missile systems may be greater, if you don't have a destroyer, if you don't have a carrier battle group on station, you just don't have it. And there is no substitute for that type of capability. The Air Force Secretary and the Chief have repeatedly testified that they don't have enough Air Force to do the missions that they're supposed to do. And they're also hinting, although this is, again, Chairman Thornberry mentioned this, is that there has been a deliberate effort to kind of constrain the amount of information coming out of the Pentagon on vulnerabilities. And that's probably to a degree right. But on the other side of that is we live in a republic. And in a republic, the people kind of put pressure, they contact their representatives in elected government, and then they in turn make the budgeting decisions. Right now, the American public does not know, because this information has been constrained, how close we are in some areas. And one of those areas is in precision guided munitions, or PGMs. And so we are keeping up, the Air Force is keeping up with demand right now for things like JDAMs and small diameter bombs. But if there was a major contingency, they don't have the stocks on hand right now to prosecute such a war, and that's a huge concern. The Air Force is the smallest it has been since 1947, down from a high of 70 fighter squadrons down to just now 32. The Marine Corps believes they need 27 battalions. Heritage assesses their need at 36, but they have just 24 right now. And then the Army is the smallest it has ever been since the start of World War II, with 476 active duty soldiers and only 31 brigade combat teams. And General Milley, the Chief of Staff, has testified that the Army should be between 550 or 540,000 soldiers in order to accomplish the military strategy. And that there is a link between these areas. And so when you have a force that is too small, it is spinning too fast, like a record player, if anybody remembers record players, spinning on 78. Yeah, I know, Fred, you just do iPod. But it's a record player spinning way too fast, and they're using up their personnel and their equipment faster than they should. The second area I wanted to talk about is capability. And remember, that's the sufficiency of their weapon systems. So as regards the Navy, their most recent major acquisition programs, the Littoral Combat Ship and the DDG-1000, were severely cut back in terms of quantities, and frankly, their ability to participate in high-end combat operations is fairly limited. They've had some successful acquisition programs, witness the Arleigh Burke class destroyer, the Virginia-class submarine, but those platforms now are at the edge of their design limits for adding any more new stuff to them. They're short on power, they can't take any more weight on the upper decks, and so they have essentially run their course, and now they're going to need more newer platforms. The Navy is also short naval aircraft, and so they are unable to fit all the carriers they have with naval aircraft, and because of the shortages and the slow delivery rate of the F-35C, they are going back and having to request to buy F-18 E and F models to make up that gap. And the E and F, F-18 is a good platform, but it's not fifth generation. And fifth generation, ladies and gentlemen, is the state of the art in terms of aircraft. And so having to go back and buy a fourth generation platform is really a suboptimal situation. The Air Force's platforms are the oldest they've ever been in their history, and the average age of an Air Force aircraft is 27 years. I think the F-15C is the Air Superiority Platform. Average age of that is 33 years old. And think about putting yourself in an aircraft that's 33 years old, average age. Before 1991, the Air Force bought an average of 510 aircraft per year. Ever since 1991, they have been buying less than 100, around 96 aircraft a year. And how did this happen? We see, we all have in our minds of our military that is the best in the world, unchallenged, sleek, gleaming, new equipment. Unfortunately, that view we have in our minds is now dated, and it needs to be refreshed with the current state of the military the way it is. The Marine Corps has got the oldest equipment of all the services. Their amphibious assault crafts were fielded in the 1970s. The light armored vehicle, the LAV, fielded in the 80s. And frankly, although they have a few programs underway right now, they will be decades before they're back up to speed. And they continue to rely on the AV-8 Harrier, which had its day days ago. And now, until they can get the F-35B, which again is a very long time away, their relief is very far away. And then finally, near and dear to my heart, the Army. Their chief has testified that because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they took a 15-year hiatus from modernization. And so the Abrams and the Bradley combat platforms they have, the tank and the fighting vehicle respectively, have no replacements even in the pipeline, not even in research and development. The chief of staff has said that those platforms will probably be in their inventory until the 2050s, 2050, which is almost hard to believe right now. As a sign of that, their biggest and newest acquisition program they have right now is the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, which is a little tiny truck. And so that's a fairly underwhelming modernization program. And then I'd be remiss if I did not mention nuclear weapons modernization. It is way overdue. The majority of the delivery platforms are older than most in this audience right here, and we're not building new nuclear warheads.
Damn, if only Bill was here.
We'd pull the average up. And we have a nuclear weapons arsenal which is more suited to the Cold War than what the situation we face today. And then finally, I'd like to talk about readiness. Readiness is a misunderstood term. It is how ready your force that you have, the force and the weapon systems, to prosecute and conduct their wartime tasks. And I mentioned that services are reluctant to talk about that. They've been told not to speak about that openly. I think that's a problem. 37% of the naval vessels in 7th Fleet had expired certifications, and they were going to sea regardless of that. And those are not for high-end tasks. Those are things like basic seamanship. Their certifications had expired, and somebody in the chain of command had signed a waiver. And we don't know what the pressures were that person was under, but what we know that was happening, and we know what resulted from that. There are 2 Virginia-class submarines, the USS Boise and the USS Albany, which have been tied up to dry dock, I think at Norfolk, for years now, awaiting availability in a shipyard and money to work on those particular platforms. So meanwhile, these multi-million-dollar attack submarines just go waiting for maintenance. And you probably all have memory, at least I do, of the days when the Soviet Union, the wall came down and we had these pictures of Soviet submarines tied to the docks and they were listing to one side and rusty. The same thing is happening to our military today. We don't have sufficient shipyard capacity to maintain the ships and submarines we have today. The Air Force short at least 1,000 fighter pilots and at least 3,500 maintainers, and that has implications that ripple across the entire Air Force fleet. And their flying hour program has been reduced gradually over time. And so it's one of these things, my grandma used to say, well, you can get used to hanging if you hang long enough. Well, that's what's been happening. Every year, a little bit of a cutback. And so now, whereas in the Cold War, Air Force pilots were getting between 200 and 300 hours per year of flying, now they're lucky if they get 130 hours per year. And if you ask them what they think about that, they say, well, it seems fine to me, because they have, in recent years, not known anything differently. We talked about the Marine Corps. They've had a spate of aviation accidents, which caused in August the Commandant, General Neller, to order a stand down while they try and figure this out. And then in the Army, only 1/3 of their 31 brigade combat teams are ready, and of those, only 3 are judged to be ready to fight tonight. Many of these things we're talking about today are not new to this year. You have seen the signs of them developing over the years, but now they are becoming even more serious. And even though, as Dr. Carafano talked about, the administration has promised resources and effort to begin rebuilding these things, those efforts have not yet been felt by the services. And this is the situation where if you have been underfunded and overused for years, it's going to take years to get that readiness back. There are no quick fixes. There are no switches to be turned on. It's only a slow and gradual process of rebuilding the military. And so, to sum all this up, a gap between what you need and what you have in the military equates to risk. And the chairman is very good about judging risk. He talks about significant and high and moderate and low, and that all sounds very dispassionate, but risk really translates into 2 things, ladies and gentlemen. One is a failure on the battlefield. We will not be successful when we undertake a military operation if the risk is too high, and it also, risk translates into casualties. America's men and women taking more casualties than should be necessary in order to conduct the missions that they need to take. So we are hopeful that this situation will turn around, but we will have to see what becomes in the coming months and years. So thank you, JB.
Yeah, thank you very much, General Spohr. As dismal as that all sounds right there, we've got the man who's got the answers on the end of the table, how we're going to repair that through our budgetary process. Fred, you've got the chair, my friend.
It's going to sound even worse, JD. Thank you. So when you read the index, one theme that cuts across every service and every assessment is the budget and the effects caused by its constraint in the recent years. In his remarks, General Spohr mentioned that every single service has been under stress from demands that are emerging from meeting the threats that we enumerate on the index. And that gap in how we meet those demands is something that the Chairman Thornberry really was very eloquent in elucidating in his remarks. Our armed forces' capacity, capability, and readiness are heavily affected by the resources that are available to them, not just dollars and cents, but also platforms and human capital, which is something that General Spohr really described. And if you go to the appendix of the index, you can go to the details of those. Proper resourcing is a necessary condition for an adequate force, but this necessary condition has been largely been neglected in the recent years. The impacts of the constrained budget on the services are widespread. We have consistently underfunded our military compared to the mission that we give them, which leads to the moral imperative that Chairman Thornberry explained in the keynote. The underfunding has reached a point that Secretary of Defense James Mattis has stated that we will need between 3% and 5% of increases for the next 5 years just to maintain our current military capabilities. Let alone, if we want to actually increase those capabilities, it will take even more than a 5% growth through the next 5 years. My role today is just to provide a perspective on how the budget has shaped our capabilities, and I'm going to talk about 2 important factors that have determined the budget and will continue to determine at least until 2021. The first one are the caps created by the Budget Control Act that is enforced for sequestration. And the second one is the effects of continuing resolutions that Chairman Thornberry mentioned during his remarks. And the letter that Mattis sent to him and to Chairman McCain is really impressive. Everyone should read if you want to have a short understanding of what continuing resolutions are doing to our military. That is the best document that is publicly available. Both these elements are very sticky and unlikely to change in the near future. And that's my grim initial vision here. Sorry. Since its passage in 2011, the Budget Control Act has played a big role defining the defense budget debate. Its caps have served to anchor the debate and define the political dynamics that shape the budget. Phrases like above the BCA caps, triggering sequestration, have become a fixture on any discussion on the defense budget. And any reporters that are still here, they probably wrote those sentences more times than they can remember. What get lost in those discussions are the tasks that our armed forces are asked to accomplish and resources required to do so. The government started determining the budget based on the cap limits, not taking into account the actual needs of our country's defense, which have been increasing through time, as Dr. Carafano spoke earlier, and as Chairman Thornberry also spoke in his keynote. The last budget done before the caps, thus more strategy-based and less resource-constrained, was Secretary Robert Gates' budget in 2011 with its 10-year projection. It serves as a baseline to illustrate and quantify the amount of risk that we're taking financially, and it goes to show the gap between a strategy-based budget and the way that we've been budgeting for the recent years. In the past 6 years, this gap has reached $433 billion. That is referencing to the 22% reduction that Chairman Thornberry spoke during his keynote. And this gap is only going to increase if we continue the current trajectory. A good way to simplify the situation is just to think that in the past 10 years, we only funded 8 years of our national defense. In the past 6 years, we also saw a consistent reduction of the defense budget as a percentage of GDP, falling from an 18-year peak of 4.7 in 2010 to 3.2 in 2016, and OMB estimates that it will reach 2.7 in 2022, which would be a new historic low. Thus, in a moment that we're asking more and more of our armed forces, we are dedicating less and less of our national output to our defense, despite the critical role that it plays in securing our prosperity. BCA caps are set to expire in 2021. Nonetheless, in their budget request for 2018, the Trump administration already contemplates extending those caps until 2027. The Senate budget resolution also includes an extension of the BCA caps. So it would not be surprising if they are extended as a part of the upcoming budget agreement for 2018. As Chairman Thornberry mentioned, the fiscal year has started this past Sunday, but we still have not decided. We're under a continuing resolution, which I'll speak soon. And also, since no one's satisfied with the BCA caps level, it allows politicians to create political leverage to advance their preferences. The caps have been altered every single year, usually for 2-year deals, creating a great situation to extract concessions from departing power. The caps have also set the stage to maintain the upward trajectory of all federal spending. Regardless of your political preference, the same negotiated outcome can be used as a valuable talking point. It creates scenarios which you can credibly claim that you have raised the defense and non-defense budget while reducing overall spending, reducing the debt and deficit, and without touching entitlement spending. It's basically political accounting magic. In the meantime, any downside can be blamed on the law, and you can just say it was the damn BCA caps. But the reality is that the law has masked the real trade-offs that we as a nation are making. Moving on to continuing resolutions. Continuing resolutions basically mean that the Congress has punted on having a budget this year. It's usually for a short period and on a scale, so they don't have to change anything. It tends to be just holding on for last year's number with usually a small increase that tends to be less of 0.5%. So don't feel bad when you file for IRS tax extensions, because Congress does that every year. A CR is designed to maintain congressional funding prerogatives, which is why there's little changes in policies. And that's why Chairman Thornberry was speaking earlier that a CR doesn't enable you to buy new precision-guided munitions that the stockpile is decreasing at a more rapid rate than it was from last year, but you can't alter that because you're under a CR, which goes to the point that General Spohr was making earlier. And Congress has required a CR to start the year 13 times in the past 17 years. And since then, DOD has averaged over 110 days under a CR every single year. That means that DOD has had to rely on a CR to operate for a third of the year, basically. In fiscal year 18, we already have 69 days of a CR scheduled. The current CR started on October 1st and is scheduled to end on December 8th. And in that time, that's when we'll see any deal come to shape or just punting more. Additionally, there are a few important implications that usually come with the passage of a CR. It creates instability on how much and when funds will be available. It also creates inefficiencies in contracting for both personnel and acquisition, since your contracting window is limited by the budget availability. Finally, you can only execute the programs that had funding in the previous year, regardless of their need in the new year. This has led multiple leaders of the Department of Defense to state that they do not schedule anything important in the first quarter, since they expect to be under a CR, and thus have little certainty on the availability of the funds. Even if the officials anticipate a CR to start the year and program around it, the time that is lost cannot be recouped. Not to mention that the instability makes the department a less attractive business partner, because you simply do not know if your contract is going to get authorized or if it's going to be possible in the beginning of the year. The lost time affects training and production schedules, which get pushed back and later, if and possible, compressed into the rest of the fiscal year. In the letter that Chairman Thornberry referenced, Secretary Mattis described that 11 ships will miss their maintenance schedule and remain unavailable longer due to current CR restrictions. Finally, think of the wasted hours that are involved in crafting one budget, then having to redo the budget to meet the criteria that will be in place for a short period of time, then redo it again for each CR, then finally redo once more when there's a final budget for that year. That is time that cannot be recouped and work created because of congressional failure. Both Armed Services Committees and the White House recognize the importance of addressing the problems that our armed forces face, a commitment that is reflected in their respective budget proposals. The White House has asked for $54 billion above the BCA level, whereas both the Senate and the House have asked for $91 billion above the BCA level. The Heritage Foundation's recommendation for the base budget is $632 billion, or $83 billion above the BCA level. Nonetheless, those impulses are still stopped by the law. You still have to change BCA. And as General Spohr described during his remarks, it took more than a year to get in the current situation, and it will take more than a year to get out. And it would probably take more than the 5-year window that Secretary Mattis has talked about, with between 3% and 5% consistent increases. To date, there is little chance of change. Congress has been unable to reach an agreement on the overall budget, and defense has been held hostage of the broader discussions. Everyone wants to talk about tax reform or health care or whatever next reform they're pursuing, and the defense budget ends up in the back burner because there's a general agreement on it, but that agreement is not realized. Like it or not, the most likely outcome for this year's budget is an agreement on increases on both defense and non-defense accounts. And they'll probably direct some extra funds to the war account, which is exempt from BCA, and call it a day. If they do that, this will bring us right back to the stage next year to describe the new fractured lines that will have appeared in our armed forces.
Can I just make one comment to wrap this all
Absolutely.
together? So arguably, if you look at the fit between the state of the world and foreign policy, this president has come up, I think, with the best fit we've seen in the last 4 presidents. The problem is you don't have a defense capability that can support that strategy over 8 years. So they can't run a perfectly good foreign policy that they have without the wheels coming off. And that, I think, is kind of the bottom line of our assessment of the index this year.
Well, thank you, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been really patient. I want to beg your patience for just a little bit more. You have the opportunity right now to pelt the experts in this room with questions. It's the one time where you've got almost all of the contributors assembled in one room. Certainly, the 4 panelists here can take on discussions regarding our particular areas of expertise, but we also have several others that are in the room. So before I give you some instructions on questions, if you feel the need to stand up and put a little bit of blood in your head right now, please feel free to do that. As you go about asking your questions, please raise your hand. I'll make sure that I tag you as the person to get the mic. Wait for it. When the mic gets there, state your name, where you're from, what your question is, and who your target of interest is in that question. And with that, are there any questions in the room? Yes, sir. Question.
Hi, I'm Michael Kraus. soldier no longer young. I'll begin with the question that I asked Chairman Thornberry. I'm going to talk on the U.S. military strength to Norwich University cadets, Marine, Navy, Air Force. What do I tell them? Honorable service. I'm going to give you a soliloquy, though, for just a second. The soliloquy goes like this. I'm a German immigrant, waited 8 years to get here. English is my second language. I'm still working. But I saw a career in the United States military, honorable service. You haven't lived until you've been to Vietnam and had B-52 strikes a little close to you, hence my hearing problem. Please speak loud. Secondly, you haven't lived until you've seen an armored division online in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. The Big Five came into our Army during the time that we went to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. The M1, the Bradley, the Black Hawk, the multiple rocket launcher, and the THAAD. They're still here, as you point out. Now, the other thing that I'm going to ask you, honorable service, how do we motivate young people to do that when there's declining resources and overcommitment? And the last part of then my soliloquy is very, very simple. How do we get this out in front of every academic institution to allow people to say, I want to serve. I want to serve in a time where I'm underpaid. Hey, I was a second lieutenant. I got $222.20 per month. Reagan fixed that. Number two, family separation allowance was $30 a month. Reagan fixed that. So give you some thought to work with. Pardon my soliloquy. Jim knows me well. Thank you. Thank you for doing this, most of all.
Well, Michael, if I could take on, you've given 3 questions. Let me take the first one on, and before I do that, let me give a soliloquy of my own. Listening to you talk, I don't think anybody needs to tell you what to say to the folks at Norwich. I think you've got it all, sir. I came on board the Service Commission in 1981 on the heels of Desert One, the failed rescue attempt, on the heels of a hollow force where we were still stepping on flight lines in 1981, 82, 83, where flight lines were filled with holes in jets where there had once been engines, and they were on back lines trying to get fixed and repaired. That's when the Reagan era began to kick in, and you began to see a complete revolution in how well our military was not just equipped, but mentally focused on being the best in the world. We have a president right now that is saying the right things, and it appears that he's moving in the right direction. And I would say to those young men and women at Norwich that right now is the time to enter the service because we're on the rise. You asked 2 more questions. How do you motivate them? And how do we get this in front of the academic environments to where we motivate young men and women to join our service and make sacrifices to go forward? And with that, I will open this up to the floor.
To JV, piggyback on his point, I would say one is our country usually gets it right. We sometimes go down dead ends and cubby holes, but in the end, we usually pull things out. And I am encouraged by the current suite of leaders that I see in the national security arena. Secretary Mattis, former Secretary Kelly, I guess Chief of Staff Kelly, the leaders we have on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, President Trump and the remarks he's made, and Vice President Pence, who's also been a really strong supporter of the military. And so I think the forces that are in favor of taking care of our military and rebuilding it are stronger than the naysayers and the ones that would argue that there are other priorities. And so I'm encouraged by that. The other thing I would say, and I said this when I was in Iraq, and I was there in Iraq in the last year, 2011, where we were responsible for getting everything out of Iraq that we had drugged there over the course of the last 8 years or so. And you cannot imagine when the military puts its mind to bringing stuff into a country, how much we can bring there. And reporters would come up to me and say, how is it ever going to be possible to get all this stuff out of here? And I would say, when the chips are down, never bet against the U.S. military. And all the stuff, when we told the airmen and the sailors and the Marines and the soldiers, okay, we're not leaving until this stuff gets out of Iraq. Whoosh, the stuff left. And so I would never bet against the U.S. military because in the end, they always pull it out.
Can I on the last point real quick, so that's where the real value of the index is in the online version, and where we've seen tremendous growth in access. So we do think we're getting good penetration in professional military education institutions. We see that because the increased use of the index by the .mil domain, but it also is an uptick in the edu domain. So and increase. I go around the country a lot, and I talk to a lot of particularly graduate programs, and you see definitely an increased uptick in access to it because it's basically a database. So it is actually supremely well designed for educational institutions and for basic research. So, and we're starting to see that definitely in the trend line and the increased use of the index.
Yeah, 1 million page views last year of the U.S. Index of Military Strength. 1 million separate, so that's not Dakota going on 700 times. That's 1 million separate page views of the index.
So I think it was second to the Kardashian, homepage.
It's a great exposure. I hope we answered your question, sir. We have a question in the back, the lady in the red sweater. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. A reporter from Voice America. I have a question about North Korea, which is halfly addressed previously. So in your index, North Korea is not listed as the greatest threat to the United States. So why it is so? Does that also mean that the U.S. military strength is so strong that we can handle North Korea militarily?
Good.
Oh, in other words, is the military attack on North Korea is an option for the United States now? Thank you.
Yeah, so as we assess the threat, I think a lot of people get it wrong in that they have a very linear view of this as, it's antagonistic, it's getting more antagonistic, they're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing that. So eventually it goes to armed conflict. And I think our assessment is it's not a linear escalation because there are limits to the degree of where North Korea can take this because the primary purpose of the nuclear program is regime maintenance. And if you start a war, it's the one thing that you could absolutely would eliminate the regime. So North Korea has a natural limit as to what it can do with its strategic aggression. The South Korea obviously has no interest in a war because they would take all the casualties. The Chinese have no interest in a war because they would have to deal with a failed North Korea. The Japanese have no interest in a war. So all the major groups involved have no interest in a linear escalation. So I think it's going to be nonlinear. So so intent matters, right? And what we pay a lot of attention to is the capability. So certainly their capability is going to mature in their nuclear arsenal, and there's no question about that. There's a limitation of what they can do with that, right? And so you look at two things from the U.S. perspective. One is our capability to stay ahead of their ability to essentially do nuclear blackmail, right? And that's resident in the status of our strategic deterrent and in the status of our missile defense forces. So we track very closely that gap between what they're producing and what we have a capability to deter. So that's one key indicator, which is why we're very much interested in what is the results of the nuclear posture review and what is the results of the ballistic missile defense review going to look like. So we have a better understanding of the long-term U.S. intent, in a sense, to stay well ahead of that North Korean threat. And then we also look at the conventional deterrence because if you can't, there's a limit to what you can do with the nuclear threat, right? And then one way you can continue to be provocative is to drop back down and challenge at lower levels, right? So do some artillery barrages, sink a ship, send some guys across the line or whatever. So you also have to be able to deter at the conventional level. And so there we look at the conventional force structure and commitment. And this is what's unique about our index is we just don't look at what the U.S. brings to the table. What these guys do is also look at what's the South Korean contribution, what's the Japanese contribution. So we also look at the capacity of the conventional deterrence. So the conventional deterrence, the strategic deterrence, and the missile defense that all adds up to our capability. We look at the North Korean capability, but also the North Korean intent. And so you put all that together, and it creates a notion of of where you put that in relation to how you judge, for example, the long-term interests and plans of the Chinese or the Russians or whatever. So that's how we get there.
Fantastic. I think we've got a question all the way in the back.
Hi, gentlemen. My name is Bridget, and my sister Claire is an airplane mechanic in the New Hampshire Air National Guard at Pease Air Force Base. And she has mentioned in the past that she'll be working on the plane, and there's some mechanical problem that would require a couple nuts and bolts that cost a lot of money, and that sometimes it's actually cheaper just to buy a whole new mechanism than to buy the nuts and bolts. So I'm just wondering what you would say would be a way to kind of work around this. It feels like it wouldn't require Congress to kind of internally work on some areas of efficiency and what you think about that. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You want to talk about efficiencies?
I'll talk about one thing, and then I'm going to ask JV to talk about one thing, and that is Chairman Thornberry has introduced in the House Armed Services Committee a proposal to allow military buyers to buy things online on things like Amazon or other globally things. Right now, you have to have a source which is approved through the General Services Administration or GSA. They have to be on the GSA schedule, it's called, and only then can you approach them with an offer to buy something. And there's Chairman Thornberry and his committee is pushing to open this whole up and maybe let some market forces actually have a crack at trying to drive down the prices of our spare parts. Now, whether or not there are actual commercial sources of the titanium fastener or whatever they need, because you can't just go to Lowe's and put a bolt from Lowe's on your F-15. I don't know, but I don't know. JB, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, sir, I do. Hey, Bridget, thank you for your question, and please tell Claire we're grateful for her service. This is one where you come into the costs of keeping an airplane in your inventory for so long that it's no longer cost-effective to keep those parts in inventory. We're finding that across the spectrum. We talked earlier about what it's like to be in a 33-year-old jet. Would you like to do that? But you really don't understand what we do to jets. Think about being in your own personal car, driving across the United States. Would you get in your personal car that was 33 years old and drive it across the United States? That's not how we treat fighter jets. We treat fighter jets like you treat rental cars. Think about getting in a rental car that's 33 years old and then driving it across the United States and knowing that if you had to pull off on an exit, that it's hostile forces on the exit, right? You can't just take any exit that you want to, and you've got to make it from point A to point B and all the way back and employ successfully in order for us to be successful as a U.S. military. This is where we come into really hard questions. Secretary Thornberry was exceptional in his description of this, as was General Spohr. You're not talking about just parts. You're talking about men and women's lives who are at risk because we cannot deliver if and when that time comes for us to go and deliver. And we need to refurbish our fleet. It's daunting. I'll add one more bit of information to it. My friends are all timing out as four-star generals right now. Talking to them is kind of interesting in a sense of what they see as the financial burdens for just the Air Force. To put it in perspective, this year the President proposed a $600 billion budget for the U.S. military. $600 billion, which is above the BCA caps. It's above it, but it's not as far as we want to take it. $600 billion in order to fix the United States Air Force just in readiness. Just in readiness. And I'm talking about just the Air Force. And I'm at $20 billion a year for the next 7 to 10 years. To refurbish the fleet with aircraft, to bring about, to come around on the backside and to flank that problem by inserting new aircraft into the inventory, $20 billion a year for the next 7 to 10 years. To fix our nuclear infrastructure, $20 billion for the next 7 to 10 years. So in order to bring the Air Force up to speed in readiness, in its fleet, and its nuclear capability, and modernize across the force, you're talking about an increase in the federal budget for DOD of 10% just for the Air Force for the next 7 to 10 years. This is not just an Air Force problem. You heard General Spohr talk about the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Our fleets in every aspect, particularly in the fighter community, is really down. And you're talking about a deficit, a hunger that's been in the makings, not just since 2004. The United States Air Force has been in the Persian Gulf on rotation since 1991. Been ongoing for a long time. So unfortunately, Bridget, this is not an easy fix, and it's not an easy solution. The near-term focus, I think, our good Congressman Thornberry said it best, is if we can get that acquisition thing, what General Spohr mentioned, to streamline that to where we can go out and get those parts on hand as quickly and as cheaply as we can. That's an immediate thumbnail Band-Aid over this. Long-term is going to take a lot of money and a lot of time.
So there's another efficiency. Maybe Fred could talk for a second about BRAC and what that would.
No, what I wanted to talk about is that the Navy has been experimenting with 3D printing just to address those type of situations, to actually print the parts, and you can do additive manufacturing and have those parts on board. You wanted to talk about efficiency, right? Yeah. So for the past 6 years, the DoD has tried to close underutilized bases that would generate around $2 billion every year that could be reinvested in other parts of the services, and Congress has not authorized them to conduct a new round. And this would be part of the efficiencies that could be taken to relieve that pressure from a different perspective.
And what happened this year in the legislation? Was it in the Senate bill and not in the House bill? Or is
the House bill completely prohibited BRAC to be executed. On the Senate, they had an amendment to authorize a new round of BRAC under different terms, but it never got voted on, and it still has the language prohibiting any of the funds to be utilized for a new round of BRAC.
Fantastic. Well, we've got time for one or two more questions, all the way in the back.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Terry Baker. I'm with Telephonics Corporation. The chairman this morning spoke or suggested that there was a lot of bipartisan support to fix the military. I'm a little bit concerned about the BCA. Do you see bipartisan support to get the BCA caps amended or fixed so that the president's budget can proceed as he would like?
Great question, Terry.
That is a great question that we'll have an answer between now and December. The weird thing that has happened recently is that a lot of people are just dejected with the rejection that they got during the NDAA votes to address the caps at all. So there were a few amendments, one removing sequestration entirely, the other one actually taking away all the limits, and none of that got even considered on the floor. So there is a sense that the Hill is a bit with their hands up in the air, like they all agree that something needs to be done, but they can't agree on what needs to be done. And I don't know if they have re-engaged in the negotiations, but that's something that needs to be solved between now and December 8th. Otherwise, we'll be going to a shutdown again.
Great. Sir, right there.
Hi, David Ensor of GW's new project on media and national security. Mr. Carafano, you mentioned Japan and Korea. I'm interested in to what extent this military strength analysis, if you could give us a little bit more on how it builds in the capabilities of allies. Take Europe, the capabilities to defend the Baltics and others. Does this analysis factor in what would be, I would assume, relatively serious forces from some of our allies?
You bet. Actually, why don't we just hand the microphone to Dakota and let him answer that? So he gets something to do here.
Thank you. So I was bringing up one of the tables that you'll see in any one of these areas in that particular section. And what we tried to use as metrics was the stability or the strength of alliances. So is there actually an obligation to go do something as opposed to, hey, I'll be there, right? And what was the nature of those? Are they strong? Are they weak? Are they problematic? The other ones then were political stability, U.S. military posture, and the infrastructure. So the political stability is I would like to be able to count on Japan, but if they're in the midst of a civil war, they might not be able to fulfill their own obligations, right? So if it's very stable, it's an ally that you can trust, and access to the ports and airfields, et cetera. Turkey is a NATO ally, but with their internal political dynamic, gaining access to facilities has been difficult for the U.S. and for some other countries. Refused the visit from a European delegation to go visit some of their own troops there at one of the airfields. So we look at that, and we look at, do we have forces in that particular country? And then if you do, good, what are the permissions for use of those forces? So we may have a squadron based at an airfield in Italy, I'd say it's Aviano. Does the rule set governing the presence of those forces allow us to conduct strike missions, or is it just relief or refueling or something along those lines, a transit point? And then the nature of the infrastructure, as well. So the totality of that is we look at the country, using Japan as an example, the size of their military, the maturity of that military in terms of the sophistication of the equipment. Is it kind of a home force, or is it something to go out and do other sorts of things? The nature of their political environment, does it enable them to deploy forces somewhere, right? So the Baltic countries, as small as they are, have been punching above their weight in providing what we would consider small detachments, but coming from a small country, and they're operating in Afghanistan or anywhere else we ask them to do. I think the Lithuanians are in Mali, I think, working with the French. And so you see the willingness of a country to participate in that. So we go through the descriptors. And if you read through the text, it talks about how these dynamics play and our understanding of the ability of an ally to contribute some kind of meaningful measure. Can I put a number to that? No, and so we try to use word descriptors. Is it really bad or is it really good? And it's a sliding scale. We didn't want to get so defined as to say, well, I can give this an 82, and next year I give it an 83. I mean, you just can't differentiate it that closely. So these kind of big chunky aggregates, and that where a country or a military capability or an adversary changes conditions, it has to be a significant enough change that it's almost inarguable. I mean, that it's a very apparent thing that we now want to account for. So,
and if I because the Baltics are actually a very good example. So if you read each annual index in the Baltics, you can see the evolution in the trend line, because burden sharing across NATO is still an issue, but it makes a difference about and it makes a big difference about who gets to 2%. Like Germany at 2% is a lot bigger than Latvia at 2%. But if you look at the Baltics in general, not only have you seen them kind of shoot for the 2% limit, but look at actually how they're doing their force planning. It's been very instructive. So through the European Reassurance Initiative, I think our tax dollars have actually been pretty well spent. So if you look at what's going on in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, what they've been doing is developing more sustainable capability that's appropriate for the defense of those countries. So, for example, buying scimitars, which are a much more limited armor vehicle than something like an Abrams, but much better suited for their terrain, much more congruent with what their defense plans are, and then look at the allied contributions that have gone in terms of other allied participation in the brigade. So, for example, the Latvians, the Canadians are partnering, and they've actually built out a respectable brigade-sized capability. And so that reflects in our thing. It also helps us, and this is one of the great values of the index, it also helps us gain an understanding of where we go with our own defense planning. So, for example, one of the things that, if we had this discussion even just 4 years ago, the answer would have been, well, if you just send more U.S. brigades, put them back in Europe, permanently stationed, we'd be happy, right? And now what we're discovering is what the ERI is really driving towards is, we've developed some capabilities. What we're really looking for the U.S. in some cases is really enablers, right? So rather than another armor brigade, we'd be more thrilled if there was an American Apache, or a Black Hawk battalion, or in many cases air defense and other kinds of enablers. And so it's helping us think through about what our contribution is in these contexts, whether it's Asia or Europe or the Middle East. And so, for example, one of the exciting things is this notion of coastal artillery, right? So the idea of having ground forces with land to sea, land to air capabilities that can help extend your ability to control sea space is kind of interesting, and and maybe those are they're mobile, and so that has utility in certainly in places in Asia, and increasingly we talk about that, perhaps in the Baltic, there's some real use for that. So it's helped us think through kind of creatively about new force structure stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that the fidelity that the index gives you, particularly if you're, again, it's this notion about not just looking about how many battalions we have, but where do you really have to go, what's already there, and what are you up against, to think, I think, much more dynamically and creatively about the nature of future U.S. force planning. Sorry to run on there.
No, it was a great answer. Sir, did you have another question?
Yeah, my name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. This is my second question. Speaking of missile defense, North Korea has shot 2 of them in the Pacific Ocean. My question is, the second one, why didn't we try to intercept? We could have, I think. That's my question.
That'd be great. Since Michaela didn't actually leave the room, why don't we just hand the microphone back to her, because she is our nuclear and missile defense expert.
Thank you so much for your question. Well, I think the reason why we did not intercept is pretty simple, and that is it did not threaten any targets of value. So there was no reason for us to spend inventory on a missile that, doesn't have that effect.
So we have the ability to actually discern where a missile is going to go within seconds of its launch. And you have to understand that there's a whole lot of beeps and squeaks that are going back to understand what the launch is going to be about before it takes place. So our understanding of this is pretty thorough, generally speaking, before the launch takes place. And I completely agree. This is one of those that wasn't going to be a threat. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
This is perhaps more of a philosophical question to write a report like this. If you look at the history of militaries throughout all time, they're always going to say they don't have the capabilities. For example, in pre-World War II, the Wehrmacht and Red Army would have both said, we're really not prepared to fight. And they probably weren't. So in trying to come up with an objective analysis, how do you filter through the inherent bias that the military says we just don't have enough? And again, I'm not disagreeing with report conclusions, but I mean that's got to be a challenge, right? To deal with that.
Right, thanks. So before we did this, because we did this kind of huge literature review, because nobody has actually ever done this before, and all I could find was a RAND report where they were said, hey, can you do something like this? And the findings were something like, we spent a year looking at it, we spent $1 million. It's really hard. If you give us another $1 million, we'll take a shot at it. It's kind of a typical RAND report. So one is the value of us doing it and not DoD doing it, because we're actually providing an independent assessment, which even though we have senior retired people from all the military services, it is not flavored or colored by any of the politics or bureaucracy of and I know because I was inside and I knew that, right, of the DoD, right? So we avoid the biases that you would find institutionally in the Pentagon trying to do this, right? Not just internally in the Pentagon, but as they produce report, which they would then have to, clear with the White House, and then they have to turn over to the HASC and the SASC and everything. So having an independent organization do it, that helps a lot. We have consistent metrics that we use every year, and so we are in a sense bound by our metrics, and so that's a important constraint, right? Because we can't reinvent what's good and what's bad, right? And that was our frustration. Part of the reason why we did this is if you look at the history of QDRs and other defense reviews, you can't line them up and say, well, have we gotten better or worse? Because every QDR rebaselines what the requirements are. So you can't go from one to the other like a stepping stone and tell anything. So we don't rebaseline requirements every year. And the third is that we made some fundamental strategic decisions up front. One is this notion of the three critical strategic areas: Europe, Middle East, and Asia. The other is the notion of having a 2 MRC capability. So that's a thing. And then the final one is the external review that the guys do. Is that we do all the work, and then we put it through a rigorous process of peer review to see if we've missed anything. So we've really tried to do, when Dakota set this up, we really kind of did our lessons learned on how QDRs and other things got done to figure out how we could build in ways to avoid those kind of institutional and methodological biases when we try to crank through the report.
Dakota, anything to add to that?
Just, I mean, it's everything plus what Dr. Carafano just said. If you were interested in the news and you only went to Fox News, or you only went to MSNBC, or you only went to your local talk radio host, then you're going to get a fairly stovepipe view of what's going on. And so what we do, and the beauty of the open source literature, is we actually take testimony from senior government officials. So they're either telling the truth, which we'll take at face value, or they're lying and they should be cashiered, right? I mean, it's one or the other. So we take that, but then we balance it with Congressional Research Service, GAO, RAND reports, other offerings from the think tank community, academia. That's why I love the essays, because they're drawing from a great cross-section of military and academics and policy experts, et cetera. And so you get this entire mixture of different points of view. And then, again, the beauty of our approach here is we also then base it in history. So the Army or the Air Force could say X about what they need, and if you look back at what they've actually done, the practical application in a given theater against a particular opponent, what did it actually take to accomplish that, right? And so it's academic studies, publicly released testimony, historical evidences, our own personal experiences, and the reason we can be independent on that is we don't take any government money at all. So the Heritage Foundation is driven exclusively, I believe, from donations from members, and a few little grants here and there, but we're not dependent on doing the things we do here at Heritage based on the contract mechanism we have with the federal government. And did we say something that was really taken, badly by the U.S. Army, for example? And so on that, you go ahead and explain it.
Well,
It just had to do with one example of where we're able to provide some independent analysis.
Yeah, so we take in every input that we can, and generally we find ourselves in agreement with really nobody. I mean, I don't mean to say that in a bad sense. We're not rock throwers, but we have the ability to look at things very objectively. If you look at Lockheed Martin's purchase, sale plan right now for the Air Force is planning on purchasing 1,763 F-35 A-model fighters. That's not our analysis. We came up with 1,260. The United States Air Force is the one who put that proposition forward to purchase that number. And so we're not in line with the Air Force's thoughts on that, and we're not in line with industry's thoughts on that. You'll see things that'll come out this week with regard to positions of Congress and the conservative caucus there with regard to space forces and the likes, and how we're not in step necessarily with the way that the proposals are going forward. So we're in a great position in a sense of being honest brokers, and we've got a record several years of doing that.
So the key in kind of doing this analysis is you only measure what you can measure, which again, we routinely get critiqued about not having a cyber score, and I'm like, dude, we've been working on this forever. As soon as we figure out how to grade cyber, we'll put it in there. But the reality is there's no way to grade it in an unclassified way. So we only grade what you can grade. And when you grade something, it's either a qualitative measure or a quantitative measure, and know the difference. And so the quantitative measures, we go out, and if we've got verifiable, consistent quantitative data, then that's what we use. If you cannot measure it quantitatively, but you can measure it qualitatively, which is true in the case of when we look, for example, at the intent of allies and adversaries, make a distinction of what you're doing, and then make sure your qualitative measure is based on expert, reliable, consistent, non-prejudiced input. So we've gone through a pretty rigorous methodology to get here, and I think it's been proved over time because of the consistency in the way the trend has developed, right? We haven't seen kind of massive leaps, ups and downs, and big shifts and stuff. So, that tends to me that we're kind of on the right track. The one thing that really shocked me is when we set this thing up, you have to have some, that's totally arbitrary. Why 5 categories? Why not 10, right? Why not 2, right? And so the notion of, 10 seems to be a really kind of fine degradation that the data doesn't really support. 2 doesn't really tell you very much, like go, no go, right? So, 5 just sounds like a right number, right? Because you got some bandwidth there, but you're not, they're pretty broad categories. What's really shocked me is I said, look, guys, when we do this, we have to have really robust categories, right? Because the Army can't be like marginal one day and like fantastic the next, right? Because that's just not, just tells you that that's not realistic. You're not going to see dramatic changes in anything unless, World War II breaks out or, a war happens, right? The reality is year to year, North Korea is a little worse or a little better, and we're a little, right? So if your categories aren't pretty robust, and your data is kind of swinging all over the place, nobody's going to take that as credible. So I said, let's come up with 5 pretty robust categories, and either take something cataclysmic or a lot of change to move from one category to the other. And because I'm the boss, Dakota said, fine, right? What has shocked the hell out of me is how quickly the U.S. military has declined in categories just over the 4 years that we have measured. And if that doesn't scare the hell out of you, then you're living in the wrong, you're not counting on the American military to defend you.
We've got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
I want to kind of go back to the gentleman up front that talked about encouraging young people with the division our country's facing like we have never seen probably in our modern history, like, for example, patriotism with Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling down, how it's taking, because that's a symbol, your national anthem, and that's probably church for most Americans, hear the national anthem, at least it's for me. So how's it affecting militarily, recruiting, retention, motivation, and even funding, is that a new trend?
Do we have an event coming up?
Yeah, 2 thoughts on that. One is that the services, I think, by and large, in 2017 are meeting their recruiting goals. Have to keep in mind, though, that the goals are for a smaller military than we need, and then there's been fairly broad acknowledgement that the military needs to grow. And so we will now see whether or not they can attract the number of volunteers they need to meet the requirements for a growing military. And that's not all certain in my mind. I know the Army, for example, had some challenge meeting their increased recruiting goals in 2017. They made them by about 300 people. So that's a challenge, and I think the more national voices we can get to talk about the value of service, patriotism, the military cannot take all of America's youth 17 to 24 years of age. There's not enough spaces for them, but there is enough opportunity for a lot of people, and they can serve in other ways, perhaps Teach for America or something like that. But we need more voices, more national leaders talking about the value of service to your country. We are having a panel next Thursday, a week from today, that talks about another looming national security crisis, and that is that only 29% of Americans aged 17 to 24 even qualify to join the military. That doesn't mean they want to join the military. That means qualify, and that's because of reasons of poor physical fitness, a lot of obesity, unable to get a high school degree, crime, or drug abuse. And so we have a situation where the majority of American youth do not qualify to join our military, and that should be a trend that is disturbing to all of us.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, very grateful for your time this morning. You've been very patient and very inquisitive. Loved the questions. I would be grateful if you would turn your focus to these 3 gentlemen to my left and give them a round of applause. I think there's lunch out in the foyer. Please feel free to enjoy it.
Davis. Yeah.